Okay, I had trouble loading. Yeah, we're off. Hi guys. My voice is still shot, as you can hear. I guess we had a part one, which had. Well, I want to welcome you to our session on angels. And if you're just joining us, we had a part one, which had a session on the angelic realm in general, in which we emphasized setting aside the baggage of our misconceptions as a central prelude to the whole program. And then the second session, we got into biblical angels, their characteristics, their limitations, and so forth. Those were our two sessions constituting a part one. But we're now going to go into part two. But before we do, a little bit of review of one prerequisite, maybe in order. We spent some time in the first session on establishing what we call the boundaries of our reality. What's wrong with the camera? Man as our reach of man, and that which was larger than us we call the macrocosm, and that which is smaller than us we call the microcosm. And examining the advances in science in both areas, we discovered something shocking. The macrocosm, our universe is finite; it's not infinite, and it had a beginning. And that becomes a profound issue in our understanding our universe. As we go the other way into the microcosm, it's even more shocking as we discover that our entire physical universe is made up of indivisible units. It's digital. And we got into the Planck limits and so forth last time. But the main idea to realize is that which we consider the reality is actually bounded in largeness and smallness digitally. And so we discover that we are actually in a virtual environment, a digital environment. In fact, we call the exterior of all of this the metacosm, that which is outside the boundaries of our physical universe. In fact, we called attention to an article in Scientific American back in 2005, which discussed the fact that our constants of physics are changing. Therefore, that implies that our physical reality is actually a shadow of a larger reality. And that caught our attention because that's exactly what the Bible's been saying all along. And most of what we're going to be dealing with, especially in the next few sessions, will be those things that are going on in the metacosm, outside the normal physical boundaries of what we regard as our physical universe. And so I want to start by looking at a passage in the scripture that is extremely provocative strategically. We find it in Daniel chapter 10, and we won't try to exposit the whole thing, but Daniel chapter 10 involves a visit of an angel in preparation of two big chapters forthcoming, but the preparation is very provocative. This is a glimpse into what I call the dark side of the metacosm. Daniel chapter 10, verse 1, in the third year of Cyrus the king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name is called Belteshazzar, the thing which was true, but the time appointed was long, and he understood the thing, and he had understanding of the vision. In those days, I, Daniel, was in mourning 3-4 weeks. That's going to be an important period of time. 3-4 weeks. I ate no pleasant bread, neither came flesh nor wine in my mouth, neither did I anoint myself at all, till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. And in the 24th day of the first month, as I was by the side of the great river, which is the Hiddekel, then I lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man, clothed in linen, whose loins were girded with fine gold of Uphaz. His body was like the beryl, his face as the appearance of lightning, his eyes as lamps of fire, his arms and feet like the color to polished brass, and the voice of his words like the voice of a multitude. Now, many of these identifiers would tend to suggest that this may have been an Old Testament appearance of Jesus Christ. There are many scholars that feel that it's not so, and I'll show you why. But clearly, it's a very, very prominent angelic visitation. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men that were with me saw not the vision, but a great quaking fell upon them, so they fled to hide themselves. Therefore I was left alone and saw this great vision, and there remained no strength in me. My comeliness was turned in me into corruption, and I retained no strength. Yet I heard the voice of his words, and when I heard the voice of his words, then was I in a deep sleep on my face, and my face toward the ground. And behold, a hand touched me, which set me upon my knees and upon the palms of my hands. And he said unto me, O Daniel, a man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak unto thee, and stand upright, for unto thee am I now sent. And when he had spoken this word unto me, I stood trembling. Then said he unto me, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that thou didst set thine heart to understand, and to chasten thyself before thy God, thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words.
Wow.
So he apparently started at the time that Daniel started his fast. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days. I should emphasize right now, this is not the guy that's sitting on the throne of Persia. This is the power behind that king. The prince of the kingdom of Persia is some kind of
Hey, no, I died.
angelic being,
Good to see
a
you.
hostile one that this guy is fighting with to get through. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me. So this is an adversary. And he needed help, apparently, because Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me. That's one of the reasons that some scholars don't believe this is an Old Testament appearance of Christ. He would have needed Michael's help. But apparently it is a very senior guy. It could be Gabriel. It doesn't say so. We don't know. But Michael is the military leader of the gang. He's a chief prince in many passages. He's the voice of the archangel that Paul alludes to in 1 Thessalonians 4 at the Harpazo. And he's also, he fought with Satan himself in Jude 9. So he's a recurring figure here, as we looked at last time.
Diane, my internet was playing up as well. I had to try and go live a couple of times. I had to reboot it a couple of times. So I wonder what's going on there.
Continuing Daniel 10. And when he had spoken such words unto me, I set my face toward the ground and became dumb. And behold, one like the multitude of the sons of men touched my lips. And then I opened my mouth and spake and said unto him that stood before me, O my Lord, by the vision of my sorrows are turned upon me, and I have retained no strength. For how can a servant of this my Lord talk with this my Lord? For as for me, straightway there remained no strength in me, neither is there breath left in me. Then there came again and touched me one like the appearance of a man, and he strengtheneth me. And he said, O man greatly beloved,
good question, man.
and be strong, yea, be strong. And when he had spoken unto me, I was strengthened, and he said, Let my Lord speak, for thou hast strengthened me. Then said he, Knowest thou wherefore I come unto thee? And now I will return to fight with the prince of Persia, and when I am gone forth, lo, the prince of Grecia shall come.
Yeah.
But I will show thee that which is noted in the scripture of truth. There is none that holdeth with me in these things, but Michael, your prince. And this whole thing is just a prelude to the climactic chapters of 11 and 12 of Daniel. But the reason I get at this opening thing, it gives us an insight behind the scenes here, in what I call the dark side. We discover that spiritual conflicts occur among spiritual beings behind the emergence of the major empires. The Persian Empire was arise, and this guy had to fight through that, whatever the spiritual behind that, to get through. And he's also he announces he's going to have to fight Greece also. Well, Greece is 2 centuries later from the Persian Empire. So there's a whole different time dimension to all these things. The other thing we learned then, it's very strange, but that these spiritual beings are territorial in some sense at least, and they have locality, and they impact and are impacted by our own actions. There's a connection of some kind between what we do in our physical universe. Here's Daniel fasting and praying, and that apparently empowered him to get through with his message to Daniel. And that gives us pause as we begin to understand that there's a war going on in the metacosm. And so we now are entering in this session, part 2, the invisible warfare side of our 4-session review of angels. And we're in session 3, what I call the dark side. We're going to talk again about misconceptions that get in our way of understanding. And then we're going to talk about Satan, his origin, his agenda, and his destiny. And there's a lot of misconceptions about this guy. We're going to talk about hybrids. Where did they come from and what's their agenda here? And in the next session, we'll go on and we'll talk some practical applications of all of this stuff. I'll add an addendum of session 1 we'll put in there about the metacosm. There's another insight that I'll add to the ones we've already drawn about a holographic universe. But then we'll continue the agenda here. We'll talk about demons. How do they differ from fallen angels? What's their agenda? What are their limitations? We'll talk about an era that is coming upon us that people are calling the age of the hybrids. Why are they calling it? What's that all about? And then we'll finalize the whole series of 4 sessions with what I call spiritual hygiene and the armor of God. What are our resources as we discover that we are both the pawns and the prizes in this warfare that's going on? So we're now going to get into session 3 in substance. You know, we see all kinds of caricatures about Satan. Most of them are quite frivolous and just tongue-in-cheek kind of things. And yet there's also, in addition to those problems, a huge body of English literature. And Dante Alighieri is one of these authors. He wrote a thing called The Divine Comedy in Italian.
If anyone sees Mike from around the world go live, can you give me a shout, please?
It is an epic poem written in the 14th century and widely considered the preeminent work of Italian literature, one of the greatest works in world literature. It is a very imaginative poem and includes an allegorical vision of the afterlife. But it's really a culmination of actually misunderstandings from the medieval church, the medieval worldview in the Western church. And so on the surface, the poem describes Dante's travels through the medieval concepts of hell, purgatory, and heaven. And allegorically, it would represent a soul's journey towards God. And of course, he draws upon Christian theology as they understood it, but much of that, unfortunately, was an error, and that confuses the situation for us. Then we get to this character called Faust. He's a protagonist of a classic German legend, highly successful scholar, but also dissatisfied with his life. He makes a deal with the devil, exchanging his soul for unlimited knowledge and worldly pleasures. Faust's tale is the basis for many literary, artistic, cinematic, and musical works. And we find that even Faust and his name used as an adjective describe an arrangement where an ambitious person surrenders moral integrity in making a deal with the devil. And so, and there are plays and puppeteer that followed from Faust. The story was, the German thing was in the 16th century. It was later popularized in England by Christopher Marlowe, who made it, he created a play called The Tragic History of Dr. Faustus. And then furthermore, Goethe comes up 2 centuries later, and he becomes, again, a dissatisfied intellectual that yearns for more and does his deal with Satan. So these ideas pervade our literature in many forms, but they tend to form a presumption.
G'day, Mike. Good to see you.
And are biblical. Where this all really starts, from our point of view, is back in Genesis 3, where God declares war on Satan. He says, I'll put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. And he shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. And this starts a warfare between 2 seeds, the seed of the woman, which is a title of the Messiah, namely Jesus Christ, and the seed of the serpent. Many people don't realize that just as there was a Messiah on the good side, there is an evil one called the seed of the serpent. That's the adversary. And these are the forces that lie behind the entire biblical scenario from the beginning of Genesis to the end of Revelation. You can study the Bible end to end as a strategy by Satan to thwart the plan of God and all the things he tries to do and so forth. And so these same forces are behind the world powers today, and we need to understand that. And so all this is going to lead to a climax where there will be a coming world leader that is Satan's man. He won't appear that way, very attractive, but he'll be welcomed, and he'll have a false prophet, and that is all part of eschatology. We won't try to get into all that here in this brief review. But we are in a period of time that is called the times of the Gentiles. And that's a sequence of empires that started with Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon and finishes with the Antichrist at the very end. This is an era of Gentile dominion. But one of the things as we go along here, it's worth taking a close look at, and that's the darkness of Nazi Germany. We're all familiar with the rise of Hitler and the Holocaust and all of that. There's some very profound lessons lying behind that, what I call the lessons of Auschwitz. If you visit Israel, one of the things you do want to do, we never visit Israel without visiting the memorial to the Holocaust called Yad Vashem. And it's a phenomenal place to visit, very illuminating. But one of the things that emerges as you examine carefully the rise of Hitler and its fall, as the Allies drew closer to the fall of Berlin, the Nazi leadership, you would think, would draw their best generals, their best resources back to defend headquarters. No, they did something very strange. The Nazi leadership increased the priorities of exterminating Jews in all the camps rather than withdraw resources for the protection of their own headquarters. The revealing thing here, as you study the orders in those days, is that the priority of exterminating Jews enjoyed a higher priority than their own survival. What does that tell you? It tells you that that was demonic. Clearly,
Yeah.
the powers there were beyond.
Yeah, that's Gabriel Wire. She loves Christmas.
Rational.
It was good, bud.
So moving on, we have, of course, the rise and the fall of America. That's a whole topic of its own. And there's some evidence that there may be the abandonment of their heritage will lead to the abandonment and wrath of God, and that may have already started, and that's a study in its own right. We certainly also have scholars beginning to recognize the possibility of the rise of an Islamic Antichrist. So it clearly, what's unfolding on our horizon will impose on us a urgent knowledge to really understand what the Bible has been saying all along. But we're going to focus here on the misconceptions of Satan. All the rest is tangential to this thing as far as we're concerned this morning. We need to guard against the fables and the distortions prevalent throughout all the world's literature. And Satan does not rule in hell. It's a common misconception. No, hell was made for him, was created for him. That's his place of incarceration, ultimately. And this also leads to another bundle of misconceptions that we all share in about hell itself. We use that term so loosely without any real recognition of what the word means. It's in Greek, it's Hades, in Hebrew, it's Sheol, and there are other words that are closely related to it that we need to understand if we're going to be precise. And one of the things we really learn about Bible studies, it pays off to really be precise, be careful. And the idea of hell, of course, has its misconceptions in literature and in art that is quite a distance from the biblical perspective. The word hell, it was derived from an English word, a Saxon word, helam, which means to cover. It's the covered or the invisible place. And in Scripture, there are 4 words that have been translated in English as hell. And one is Sheol, that's the Hebrew word in the Old Testament. Hades is the Greek equivalent term. Gehenna and Tartarus are also translated hell, but are quite different conceptions than Hades, frankly. So Hades, Gehenna, and Tartarus is Greek. Sheol is in the Hebrew. And the Sheol occurs 65 times in the Old Testament, derived from a root word meaning to ask or demand. In other words, the word really implies insatiableness. Proverbs 30 really focuses on that. It's rendered grave 31 times. That's technically not quite an accurate translation. I'll show you why in a minute. And it's grave in a collective sense. Grave and Sheol are quite different. Sheol is rendered hell 31 times. It's the place of disembodied spirits is really the intention here. And so the inhabitants of Sheol are the congregation of the dead, according to Proverbs 21. It's the abode of the souls of the wicked dead, specifically in a number of places. It's also, though, the domain of the good that have passed. We see that in the Psalms, many places. So Sheol is described as deep, dark, and with bars all through Job. And the dead go down to it. So at least linguistically, it's a downward conception, a geocentric conception. But Sheol is not to be confused with a grave. There's a different word in the Hebrew. And sometimes the word Sheol is used connotatively. But the grave is a physical place for the bodies, not the disembodied spirits. You can own a grave. You can use graves in the plural. There can be many graves. Sheol is never in the plural. It's always in the singular. And a grave is physical, receives the bodies, and it can be used in the plural. One can have title to. You can own actually several graves and so on. Sheol is singular, never used in the plural. It's a different conception. And so now the Greek equivalent term is Hades. And it's the word for that which is out of sight to denote the place of the dead. And It's translated hell 11 times in the New Testament. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, uses Hades to translate the term Sheol into the Greek, and that's used on 61 occasions. So they're equivalent terms for our purposes. In Greek, it's associated with Orcus. In the Greek conception of Hades, it had two subterranean divisions, Elysium and Tartarus. And that turns out to parallel the perception we draw from Luke 16, we'll come to in a minute. Elysium is the good place, the paradise equivalent, sort of. Tartarus is the dark, bad place, if you will. We'll come back to that later. So Hades really refers to the abode of the unsaved dead prior to the great white throne judgment, for sure. That's what Revelation 20 talks about. It's a prison. It has gates, bars, and locks, according to Matthew 16 and other passages. It is a downward concept in some sense. The righteous and the wicked are separated in Hades, apparently. And so some view the blessed dead as part of Hades that's called paradise, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And it's also alluded to as Abraham's bosom in Luke 16, and we'll look at that in detail here in a minute. And the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16 are a place where we learn most of these conceptions that the Lord Jesus taught us. And the rich man lifted up his eyes and could see the bosom of Abraham afar off. So strangely, he's in the dark place, the bad place, but he's aware. He has consciousness. He's aware, and he knows that that Lazarus is in the good place. So he somehow is conscious of all of that. And so Abraham's bosom is regarded in heaven in Matthew. So that term is used two ways. I'll try to resolve that ambiguity in a minute. And so most of the early church fathers regarded paradise as a part of heaven, not Hades. And the two compartment view that we're talking about is somewhat an accommodation to the Greek conception, but it is the one that undergirds Luke 16 that the Lord's teaching us from. There's another term that comes up, and that's Gehenna. And that's quite different. It originally was Gehenna Hinnom, which is the valley of the sons of Hinnom. What it originally was a physical, a city dump. It was a deep, narrow ravine south of Jerusalem, and separating Mount Zion from the hill of evil counsel. And here the idolatrous Jews offered their children in sacrifice to Moloch in a very dark era of their own back then. And so Gehenna is the valley that afterwards became the city dump. The fire was continually burning there, so it becomes idiomatically the ultimate lake that burns with fire and brimstone and everlasting condemnation. And it's used in that sense 11 times by the Lord Jesus himself as an idiom for what really is hell in the ultimate sense. Now, the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone. Now, I want to distinguish Hades and Gehenna. They're different. Both are translated hell in the English, but that causes the confusion. Hades is temporary. Everything that's in Hades will ultimately end up being thrown into Gehenna at the end in Revelation 20. And Gehenna is forever. It has no end. It's outside the time dimension. And Hades is in the earth. It appears to be geocentric, at least in concept, if not actually. It also seems to be associated with the bottomless pit, the abusa, or the abyss. And there is a term that we run into, the outer darkness, that is misunderstood by most scholars that haven't done their homework. I'm among them. We all have made the same mistake. We all assume that the outer darkness was an allusion to Gehenna. We discover by examining the Greek and some other aspects that that's doubtful, that it is simply a misunderstood phrase having to do with the being separated from the Shekinah, and that's a special study in its own right. I just want to alert you to the fact the outer darkness thing is a controversy of its own, that the expert
Why? It snowed here a couple of weeks ago. So that's how crazy it's getting. It's summer, but 2 weeks ago, it snowed. And it snowed pretty heavy.
exegetes will point out that that doesn't translate properly the way we think of it. So, but anyway, we keep moving here. Tartarus is another word translated hell. It only has one use in the New Testament, and that's by Peter. And it shows up in Homer's Iliad. Tartarus is the deepest abyss of Hades, is the way it's described. It's as far below Hades as the earth is below heaven. So I don't know what that all means, except I don't want to go there.
No, it's
so
not.
Tartarus. It's the specific place of incarceration of angels that sinned. We're going to talk about the angels that sinned, fallen angels that sinned, that have a special place of incarceration. Tartarus is the label for that. They get released in a very strange way in Revelation 9, apparently. The other term we want to deal with is the abuso. And
Cool, Diane.
it's another term that relates to what we call the bottomless pit or the abyss. The Greek is abusos in the Greek. And this is where the beast of Revelation 11 and 17 emerge out of. And it's also where Satan is going to be bound for 1,000 years. And so that is, in that sense, a temporary holding place to hold Satan during the millennium. He'll be released at the end of it. It's also the place, apparently, from which the demon locusts emerge in Revelation 9. So it shows up in our Bible several key places. So that we're dealing here with what collectively might be called the underworld. And Hades is the collective Greek term for it. It has two compartments, a place of torment and a paradise that's sometimes called Abraham's bosom. But that two-compartment concept is the Greek concept, but it's also the one the Lord portrays when we look at Luke 16. Most of what we know about the underworld derives from the details in Luke 16. And we also encounter an impassable gulf between those two compartments that you can't pass from one to the other, the Lord tells us. There's also an allusion made to the abuso.
Why, some towns went underwater 3 times this winter. We had some really bad floods all up and down the east coast of Australia. Probably the worst floods in a century. That's what I was saying.
Bottomless pit. And most of us presume that that may be somehow linked to the impassable gulf, but that's a presumption on our part. And so Tartarus is also probably another Greek term for the abuso, if you will. But in any case, the rich man and Lazarus, a very key chapter for you to study on your own. The man in Hades, though, the rich man who dies and goes to Hades, is fully conscious. We recognize that from the. By the way, that's not a parable. That's an actual event. In parable, people don't have names. And here we have a specific name in Lazarus. No, Jesus describing.
Guys, check out Diane's doggies. Look at the doggies. There's my doggy getting jealous. It's better there.
Some specifics. And the man in Hades had a memory. He was able to speak. He was in deep pain, and he had intense desires. His eternal destiny was irrevocably fixed. He understood that. He never questioned it. He never felt it was unjust, strangely enough. In fact, he knew just what he was experiencing was fair and just, and he alludes to that. He also knew what his brothers needed to do to avoid his own fate, to repent. He pleads for someone to get that message to his brothers so that they wouldn't inherit the fate that he is suffering. And he was not yet in hell, by the way. He was in Hades. Gehenna is yet future on his situation. In fact, that guy asking for a touch of water is still waiting today for that. And so now the question is, okay, when Jesus goes to the cross, spends 3 days in the grave, he goes down there to declare his victory. And we understand that he then gathered those that were in Abraham's bosom to be with him from that point on. So he emptied out that section of Hades is the widespread theological, primarily from 1 Peter 3:19 and some other passages. And so misconceptions of Satan. He does not rule in hell. Hell was created for him. And there are 2 prevalent myths about Satan we want to be conscious of. The first one is that he doesn't really exist, that it's just a collective term for evil or something. No, he's a person, he has personality, he had an origin, and he has a destiny. And anyone that doesn't believe that he exists should try resisting him for a while. And that will become very, very clear to you personally. The second thing, to realize he has locality. He's not everywhere. He's not omnipresent. But his resources are obviously enormous, and it's very substantial. And so there are two passages that we have to really review to understand where we get the biblical notions of what Satan is really all about. Ezekiel 28.
What's
is
it
one of
names,
those.
Diane?
Both of them are strange passages in that they puncture a local reference to go get behind what's really going on. The power behind the throne might be the subtitle here.
It was cute,
In Ezekiel 28, starting at verse 1, the word of the Lord came again unto me, saying, Son of man, say unto the prince of Tyrus, thus saith the Lord God, because thine heart is lifted up, and thou hast said, I am a God, and I sit in the seat of God in the midst of the seas. Yet thou art a man, and not God, though thou set thine heart as the heart of God. So Tyrus is a king that's on an ego trip, and it's used as the occasion to make some other comments here. And the prince of Tyrus is actually the guy on the throne. And but thou art a man, okay. He claims that he's a god. And that's what Isaiah uses for the king of Babylon in the next thing we look at. There are other examples of this, the boast of Pharaoh in Ezekiel 29, the praise given to Herod Agrippa by the tyrants in Acts 12. Many times you find a tyrant on an ego trip really believing that he somehow is a god. And Paul's description of the Antichrist, the man of sin, is with nearly the same words, 2 Thessalonians 2. He says, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God. That's the Antichrist we're talking about. And that is worship, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. That's the final peak of ego that the Antichrist will achieve in 2 Thessalonians 2. I sit in the seat of God. Tyre was known as a holy island, by the way. The thought was as if it rose from the rock throne of God. That was the concept of the time. Though thou set thy heart. See, the words remind us of the temptation that was given by Satan in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3, verse 5. But let's continue here. Behold, thou art wiser than Daniel. There's no secret that they can hide from thee. With thy wisdom and thine understanding thou hast gotten these riches, and thou hast gotten gold and silver with thy treasures. By thy great wisdom and by thy traffic hast thou increased thy riches, and thy heart lifted up because of thy riches. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, because thou hast set thine heart as the heart of God, behold, therefore, I will bring strangers upon thee, the terrible of the nations. They shall draw their swords against the beauty of thy wisdom, and they shall defile thy brightness. They shall bring thee down to the pit, and thou shalt die the deaths of them that are slain.
Hey, Jay, good to see you, mate.
Wilt thou yet say before him that slayeth thee, I am God? But thou shalt be a man and no God in the hand of him that slayeth thee. So that's the prediction God is giving the ego, this guy that is on the ego trip here. And the guy's named by secular history as Ethel III. He was removed from his throne by Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th century. So the power behind the throne. Now the language starts to shift strangely as God continues this theme here. The prince of Tyre is the first 11 verses. That's an actual king of Tyre that is being dealt with here. And the word is ruler there, the man at the top, and so forth. Now, this ruler was, as I say, Ethel III. The king of Tyre is a term that's going to show up here in the next group of verses that it's a different term, a term that Ezekiel doesn't use of earthly kings, strangely enough. And moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation upon the king, the Melech of Tyrus, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God, Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. What we're going to sense here is there's a shift in scope. The text here is going to go far beyond the person that sitting on the throne. It's going to be focusing on the power that's behind the guy on the throne, as you'll see the language unfold here. The king is, again, a term that is used.
Hey, Isaiah, good to see you, bro.
The sum full of wisdom, perfect in beauty. Now, these are superlatives that apply to this king. And so even though it's applied to the king of Tyre, and once it's similar language that Isaiah is going to use in Isaiah 14 on Satan himself, as you'll see. The king, well, actually, the king of Babylon. But there's an ulterior or an accomplishment in Satan and his embodiment in the Antichrist is going to surface here. So let's take a look at it. God continues, Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. That's certainly not the case of the king sitting on the throne of Tyre. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, the topaz, the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and the gold. Thy workmanship of thy tabrets and thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created. So this is a created being here. These precious stones are an ancient way of describing different colors of light. And we find their use in many places in the Bible in a very similar way. And that was in the Garden of God. Eden was on the earth, and this is obviously a change of scope there. On these precious stones, they are the same stones that we find in the breastplate of the high priest. And the first and the 12th, the first and the last of these are the sardius, which speaks of Reuben, behold the sun. The last one, Jasper, the son of my.
And guys, do you reckon that's where Marvel gets the gets the idea of these sacred stones like the Tesseract and all that Thanos and all that hunt down? Do you reckon it's related to these 12 stones that the Jew Pharisees wear? I reckon it is. Somehow it's connected to it.
Again, we discover there's all kinds of implications of those stones in the breastplate of the high priest. And 9 of them are mentioned here of the 12. And we have to get into the reason these show up so significantly to anyone.
Yeah, that's true as all.
The Bible is we see them show up again as descriptions of the New Jerusalem, the strange hyperspace that shows up at the end of Revelation 21. The building of the wall was of jasper, the city was of pure gold, like unto clear glass. The foundations of the wall of the city were garnished with all manner of precious stones. The first foundation was jasper, the second sapphire, the third.
I saw that hand.
Emerald, the fifth sardonyx, then the sardius, then the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprasus, and 11th jacinth, and the 12th an amethyst.
And post a link if you can find it, please, because that is pretty stunning.
One of the difficulties in analyzing these things is the labels of those stones change through ancient years. So it's hard to correlate the New Testament allusions here with the Torah allusions earlier and so forth. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls, and every gate was 1 pearl, and the street was pure gold, as it were, transparent glass. So we're dealing in a hyperspace. We talked about that.
See, Isaiah, we're all on the same page here. We check it out too.
In the first session. But the other thing it mentions here about the tabrets and thy pipes, which are musical terms. And so the tabrets and pipes that's why some scholars suspect that Lucifer's job before he fell was to head up worship, because his musical skills apparently were unexcelled. And tabrets are tambourines, and pipes are the holes in the musical pipes and so forth. Those are the terms in the Hebrew there. But he continues now, thou art the anointed cherub that covereth. Strange term. That term implies that he was a cherub, a super angel that we talked about previously.
Thanks, Isaiah, for the link.
He was the anointed one that covereth. He was the one in charge of the whole program. It says, thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee so. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. And again, the super angels we talked about in the previous sessions. Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created, in the saddest word of all, until the iniquity was found in thee. So he was a created being, as all the angels were. They were created before the earth was, and so forth, because they cheer when the earth is formed. And yet, Christ was the one that created him, and God used the Logos to create all things, we discover from many passages, and including Satan was a created being. So with all his power, he's still just a created being, until iniquity was found in thee. Iniquity fell because of pride. We're going to see that in the Isaiah passage, and that's why God hates pride. And so Ezekiel's describing this king in terms that could not be applied to mere man. This king appeared in the Garden of Eden, verse 13. He had been a guardian cherub in verse 14, and he had possessed a free access to God's holy mountain, and he was sinless from the time he was created, at least for a while. And so that's where sin began, in his heart. And he said, by the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. Therefore I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of God. I will destroy thee, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Therefore I cast thee as profane. So this is where Satan is cast out. And there's a lot of scholastic debate as to exactly when that happened. All we know is that it had already happened by the time you get to Genesis 3. And we'll move on that. He was driven out of the place of sanctity where he had once occupied. And he's the covering cherub, the guy in charge. Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom and thy
Okay, Ryan, good night.
I will cast thee to the ground. I will lay thee before kings, that they may behold thee. And because all through pride. And thou hast defiled thy sanctuaries by the multitude of thine iniquities, and by the iniquity of thy traffic. Therefore I will bring forth a fire from the midst of thee, and it shall devour thee. And I will bring thee to ashes upon the earth, in the sight of all them that behold thee. That's his destiny. All they that know thee among the people shall be astonished at thee. Thou shalt be a terror, and never shalt thou be any more. So that's that passage. Isaiah 14 gives us a similar glimpse into the origin of Satan. And this is a lamentation on the king of Babylon, but it really goes far beyond the literal king of Babylon. So, how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? So, fallen from heaven, this is Lucifer. That was his original label. And we have the famous 5 I wills here. God says, for thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne upon the stars of God. I will also sit upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. The I will, the I will, the I will, the 5 I wills. And now, yet thou shalt be brought down to Sheol, to the sides of the pit. And they that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee, and consider thee, saying, is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms, and that made the world as a wilderness, that destroyed the cities thereof, that opened not the house of his prisoners? Now, when did that all happen? There are some people that believe that it happened between the first 2 verses of chapter 1 of Genesis. But that, again, is a whole other study that we explore in another area. But when did that happen? We don't know. But there's some strange allusions that reference that in Jeremiah 4 and Ezekiel 31. But let's just go on here. All the kings of nations, even all of them, lie in glory, everyone in his own house. But thou art cast out of thy grave like an abominable branch. And as the raiment of those that are slain thrust through with a sword, that go down to the stones of the pit, as a carcass trodden under feet. Thou shalt not be joined with them in burial, because thou hast destroyed thy land and slain thy people. The seed of evildoers shall never be renowned. The Lord of hosts hath sworn, saying, surely as I have thought, so shall it come to pass, and as I have purposed, so shall it stand. That I will break the Assyrian in my land, and upon my mountains tread him underfoot. Then shall his yoke depart from off of them, his burden depart from off their shoulders. Very strange allusion here to the Assyrian. We discover the first world dictator, Nimrod, was an Assyrian. In effect, we know that the Pharaoh of Egypt during the Exodus was not Egyptian. He was an Assyrian, according to Isaiah 50. And that term is also used of the Antichrist, strangely enough. So we find it showing up very interestingly in a number of key places. I'll leave that for further study. We'll go on here. This is the purpose that is purposed upon the whole earth, that this hand that is stretched upon all the nations, the Lord of hosts hath purposed, and who shall disannul it? His hand is stretched out, and who shall turn it back? And so this is God's purpose. So here we have Satan. We've talked about his origin in these 2 key passages, Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14. We're going to see his agenda summarized for us in the 12th chapter of Revelation. And we're going to find his destiny is unequivocally detailed in the last few chapters of the book of Revelation. And so now we have a study of the kingdom, power, and glory that starts with a side study of the origin of evil, where we go into some of these things and the idea of the fall of Satan occurring before sometime prior to the 2nd verse of the book of Genesis. We also go to thy kingdom come. What does that really mean? Most people don't understand. We really try to nail down the eternal security issue and the inheritance and rewards, which makes this, of course, a very controversial study, and the whole counsel of God being your remedy to avoid heresy. So those studies I recommend to you if you want to get further into some of these issues. But Satan is an actual person. He's not some kind of force or personification of evil. We need to understand that. He has intelligence. He has emotion. He has volition. He makes choices. He is a morally responsible being, apparently. And he was created. He was originally very good. He was created by Christ and for him. And yet sometime after his creation, before Genesis 3, he rebelled against God and lost his holy condition through conceit. There's little doubt that he's a fallen angel, obviously. After his fall, he led both angels and human beings into spiritual death by his murderous and truthful schemes. That's all documented in both the Old and New Testament.
Isaiah, apparently that was one of the reasons for the Iraqi war. They went in because they found Nimrod's tomb, and the Americans wanted the body, the DNA. I'm not sure how true that is, but it was one of the theories getting out there.
Discovered from Revelation 12 that 1/3 of the angels apparently rebelled with him and are part of his cadre. And so he's also, has many titles. He's spoken of as the prince of this world. That's a strange title. Think about it. He's the God of this age, according to Paul in 2 Corinthians 4. He's the prince of the power of the air. He is the evil one. He is the enemy. He is a murderer, liar, and a father of lies, according to Jesus' own words in John 8. He is called the tempter. He is an adversary like a roaring lion. That's what the word Satan really means, is our adversary. He is spoken as the great dragon who deceives the whole world in Revelation 12. Great dragon is there identified. That symbol is identified for you by John. He's the ancient serpent in 2 Corinthians 11, Revelation 20, and elsewhere. He's the angel. He's an angel of light. He's not ugly, by the way. All these artists' attempts notwithstanding, he's extremely attractive. That's the problem. And he can be an angel of light. He's referred to as Beelzebub and Belial as various titles. He has his own kingdom, we learn in Luke 11. And the whole world is under the control of the evil one, John emphasizes to us in several places.
Yep.
So we need to understand that. And his powers are great, but he is not all powerful.
Yep.
He's able to affect the processes of nature. He's supposed to cause even physical death. He's not omnipotent, however. He needs God's permission to do what he does. That's a very, very important thing to understand. Everything that happens to you is Father filtered. And so he's extremely wise, of course, but he's not omniscient. He travels rapidly around the world, but he's not omnipresent. He has great influence in the affairs of human government, yet his forces are not invincible. That's one of the things we learned from Daniel 10. And there is a summary of him in Revelation chapter 12, where we have the imagery of the woman and the man-child. And we have the woman, who is identified with the sun, moon, and 12 stars, strangely, with a man-child. And we have a red dragon that's trying to attack her, has 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns,
Oh, Zeus.
to devour the man-child when born. He's identified in verse 9 of chapter 12 as none other than Satan, so we know who that one is. The man-child is clear too, because he rules all the nations with a rod of iron, and that identity is used dozens of times throughout both the Old and New Testament of none other than the Messiah. And he's caught up to God in his throne, which most of us visualize as the ascension. It may include something else I'll come back to. And so the woman flees into the wilderness for 1260 days. Michael and his angels fight the dragon and his angels, and the dragon is cast to the earth, and he persecutes the woman for 3.5 years. The 1260 days, the 3.5 years, the half of a 7-year period, the 42 months, all those designators are used in both the Old and the New Testament for the most documented period of time in the Bible, namely that time when she is persecuted, specifically what the Lord labeled as the Great Tribulation. Well, who are these players? The woman is not the church. Some scholars are a little confused about that. She is identified by none other than Jacob when he interprets Joseph's dream. The sun, the moon, and 12 stars are idioms of the nation Israel, and they're used, so used. And also, the church is not if the woman's the church, she's in trouble because she's pregnant. She's going to have a man-child. That's not the church. No, it's Israel. Israel brought forth, that her purpose was to bring forth the man-child, the Messiah. And the red dragon, of course, is identified as the serpent, devil, and Satan. And the man-child, of course, is the kinsman redeemer, the Messiah himself. which leads to an interesting, I think it was G.H. Pember that first suggested the possibility when you talk about the man-child being caught up to God in his throne, it certainly includes the ascension, but idiomatically it may include the harpazo,
Okay,
the
the
capture
Son.
of the body of Christ. Well, that's only one person.
Thank
yet,
you,
but
Jeremiah,
that's the
just
way it's
son.
used there. So that's a possibility, a very provocative one when you, because what follows all that is, of course, the Great Tribulation and the rest of it. So that's another whole, that's an eschatological study I encourage you to undertake yourself. So Satan's whereabouts. God expelled him from the Mount of God. We discovered in Ezekiel 28. He was cast from God's government in heaven, but is still allowed access to God, according to Job 1 and others. And in the tribulation, Satan will be cast from heaven and restricted to the earth. And during the millennium, he'll be confined to the bottomless pit. And the two beasts of Revelation 13 will be cast into Gehenna. But Satan has 1,000 years incarceration before he gets released. He leads another rebellion, and then he is cast in the lake of fire forever. And so that's his destiny, all very explicit in Revelation chapter 20. Now, his stratagems all along, way back, he tried to corrupt Adam's line by the generation of these hybrids. We're going to talk about those. Adam's seed being corrupted in Genesis 12 and so forth, that he goes after the famine in Genesis 50. The destruction of the male line when Moses was the one that was saved from the orders of Pharaoh to kill all the Jewish children. Pharaoh's pursuit during to try to wipe them out after the Exodus was again all attempts by Satan to wipe out God's purpose here. When God tells in Genesis 15 tells Abraham that his people will leave the land for 400 years and then come back, that gave Satan 400 years to lay down a minefield, and he populates them with the same thing he did in Genesis 6. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then as God focuses his prophecies on what he's going to do, it allowed Satan to focus his attacks. When God announced it was going to be Abraham, Abram was singled out. When God announced it was going to be through the line of David, David is singled out from 2 Samuel 7 and following. And Joram kills all his brothers, but misses one. And the Arabians
Okay,
slew
see you when you
all,
get back, mate.
but missed one, Ahaziah. And Athaliah tried to kill all of the descendants, but missed a servant hid one of the babies. And so all the way through, Satan's trying to wipe out the royal line. He never quite makes it. And all the way through, even in Esther, the Persian Empire, Haman's attempt to wipe out all the Jews is a satanic plot. But God is always ahead of him there. And so in the New Testament, Joseph's fear when Mary was pregnant he was concerned for her. Herod's attempts to kill all the babes in Bethlehem is a well-known issue around Christmas time. When Jesus is at Nazareth trying to give the sermon, they tried to throw him off a cliff. And there were two storms at sea, which I believe were not natural storms. There's an undercurrent behind those. But Satan's trying, and then of course the ultimate attempt is where Satan attempts to wipe out of the cross. And that whole summary, of course, is in Revelation 12, which we looked at it. But the main point is he's not through yet. He is still not through with his agenda, because he believes if he wipes out the believing Jews, he can thwart the return of the Lord. And so he has some lieutenants we need to be aware of. The locust of Revelation 9 had a king over them, we learned, the angel of the abyss, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, in the Greek Apollyon. Some people believe those are just similar titles of Satan. They might be. I'm among those that believe they're just senior lieutenants of his for whatever reasons, but they're alluded there in Revelation 9. They're also the locusts of Amos 7. Many people miss this because the Masoretic text has an unfortunate translation. You get into the Greek, the Septuagint, it's clear the locusts of Amos 7, verse 1, had a king over them by the name of Gog. So when you get to Ezekiel 38 and 39, you're dealing with a demonic title that is not defined for us back in Amos 7 in the Greek, for what it's worth. So, but let's get back to this event of the hybrids. Satan had a very bizarre strategy that led to the flood of Noah. And Genesis chapter 6 is the key to it. It also echoes in Numbers 13 and again in Revelation 9. Let's take a look at this here. Genesis chapter 6, verse 1. I want you to notice something most commentators miss, that the first two verses are one sentence. So let's read it as one sentence. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the Benai Elohim, the sons of God, saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. So the sons of God are picking up on the daughters of men here. Okay. The word sons of God is a key term here, Benai Elohim. In the Hebrew, it refers to a direct creation of God, which involves two things. Adam was a direct creation of God, and the angels were. And we are sons of Adam, unless we've been born again. If we haven't been born again, we're sons of Adam. Adam is a created, direct creation.
Guess who's got gold?
And, the daughters of men is a different term. That's Menachadam. Daughters of Adam, not daughters of Seth, as some people are taught in seminary. That's a misconception to try to skirt what the scripture's really saying. And so, sons of God, and they're angels. That's a term for angels. Obviously, Adam was direct creation, but the term is used then throughout the Old Testament as a term for angels. In Job chapter 1, 6, 2, 1, 38, 7, it's a term for, obviously, angels. Even in Luke, chapter 20, verse 36, we find the same appellation used there. The book of Enoch, which is not part of the Bible, but it's a 2nd century BC compendium of rabbinical beliefs, and it's useful for vocabulary and for understanding what their views were. It's not part of the Bible, but they also recognize that term that's used of angels. And the Septuagint, the translation of the Old Testament into Greek, always uses the term angelos for translating that Hebrew term. And so it goes on in verse 4, but they were Nephilim in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children of them, the same became the mighty men which were of old, men of renown. So the strange output of this unholy combination are hybrids of some kind, called Nephilim. The Nephilim, key term. Now, in the Hebrew, it's Nephilim, and it's also after that. It's not just before the flood of Noah. I want you to keep that in mind. The Nephilim, it's the fallen ones. It comes from a Hebrew word, nephal, which means to be cast down, to fall away, to desert. So Nephilim are the fallen ones, is what the term actually means. And the Hagibarim are the unnatural offspring here, the mighty ones. Now the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament, uses the word gigantes. And they happen to be giants, but that's not what the word means. The word gigantes means the earthborn. It comes from gigas, which means earthborn. And so, yes, they happen to be giants, but you miss that in the translation, that it's actually the earthborn or the fallen ones. Again, we're talking about these hybrids. When you get down about the 9th verse of chapter 6, you learn something else about the genealogy of Noah. These are the generations of Noah, the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. The word perfect there is the word tamim in the Greek, actually in the Hebrew, which it means without physical blemish, sound, healthy, without spot, unimpaired. In other words, Noah's family were not corrupted by the mixture of these hybrids that Satan had introduced into the picture. That may be one of the reasons he was picked. Now, a lot of people get concerned, can angels have sex? They're confused because in 2 places in the New Testament, Jesus tells us that angels in heaven, in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. We're not talking about fallen angels here. We're talking about angels that are in heaven, unfallen. We do notice that angels, when they appear on the earth, are always male. It's interesting when you get to the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah. That whole episode in Genesis 19 makes no sense until you realize that they were masculine angels. But anyway, there's another word that we want to understand that is in the New Testament twice. Okaterion in the Greek. It refers to the body as a dwelling place for the spirit. It's a technical term used only twice in the Bible. It's from which the angels that fell had disrobed, and that's in Jude 6. It's also used alluding to the heavenly body for which the believer longs to be clothed, our resurrection body, if you will. In Jude 6, and the angels which kept not the first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of that great day. So Jude here is making an allusion to this. And he compares it with even Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh. Set forth an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. So when you look at this passage here, the word habitation in the Greek is actually the word okateria. It's that which they left. They left that estate. They disrobed themselves of the estate they found themselves in. So they somehow were able to shuck that off in some way. In contrast to that, in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 1, 2, we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And for in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our house, which is from heaven. And the word house there, strangely, is okaterion. So I'm beginning to suspect that has a technical term that restricts its use in a very special way. But meanwhile, you and I'll go on. It turns out the Nephilim were not limited to those strange goings on before the flood of Noah. Because when we get in Genesis verse 4, it said it happens also after that. What's it referring to? Well, there were 4 tribes we find in Genesis 14:15. The Rephaim, the Emim, the Horim, and the Zamzumim, which apparently were bad news because Joshua was told to wipe out a man, woman, child of those 4 tribes. That's pretty strange stuff. When you get to them encountering Canaan, Numbers 13:33, we discover that in the land of Canaan were Arba, Anak, and his 7 sons, the Anakim. They were also giants. They were Nephilim. In fact, the spies call that. There are Nephilim in the land, they announce in Numbers 13:33. And we have Og, the king of Bashan, who's the king of the giants in Deuteronomy 3 and Joshua 12 and so forth. And Goliath and his 4 brothers. That's why David picked up 5 stones when he crossed this thing. He was ready for all 5 of them. We all know the story of Goliath. He was a son of Anak. He was an offspring of these strange creatures. So anyway, we have looked at the dark side here, rather superficially perhaps. We talked about the rampant misconceptions that we're facing. We talked about Satan, his origin, his agenda, and destiny. And we've had a touch on the hybrids, their origin and role. We're not through with them. We're going to discover they have a modern counterpart, apparently. We'll talk about it in the next session. But as we get to the next session, it'll have a prelude of a metacosmic addendum. There's something about the metacosm I didn't feel it was we had time to add in our first session, but it's like a footnote or a supplemental addendum on the existence of our reality that I think you'll find rather provocative. But that's sort of just an addendum, a supplemental note. We're going to go right on into the demons and their agenda and limitations. They're very distinct from angels. We'll talk about how they're different. We'll also talk about the age of hybrids that's coming upon us, and that's going to have some aspects that may surprise you. And finally, of course, we'll talk about, okay, given what we have summarized in these sessions, what does that imply for us personally in terms of our spiritual hygiene and what are our resources, namely the armor of God? And so that'll be next time.
Okay, I got that lined up, guys, but first I'll play this.
And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them, wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and of the creeping thing, and of the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. It's amazing that we were just there in Jeddah. Jeddah is called the gateway of Mecca, And this biblical flood has come. In fact, it is the highest ever recorded rainfall in a 6-hour period, stretching from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. on November the 25th. And it's very dry over there. When you come to Saudi Arabia with me, you will see how absolutely dry it is. It is hot and it is dry. And then suddenly this flood comes that washes away cars and people.
يلا رحمتك يا رب حبيب تنزل ودعناك الله في مالنا في حلالنا في حيالنا يا رب وخر 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 تعال
The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me. For the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. This broke the record that was set in 2009. So it wasn't even long ago when another freak catastrophe happened. And in that case, 120 people died. Thank God this time, so far, only 2 people died. Now, you know that they will always blame climate change. They want everything to fit the narrative. But of course, these natural catastrophes, they have happened before in history, long before we drove cars. But they are accelerating and increasing in certain locations. And what Genesis chapter 6, 7, 8 to 9 tell us is that these floods come as a judgment for a very specific type of judgment. I went through this in my biblical justice series where I define what type of judgment usually comes in response to what type of sin. It's very poetic.
Wow, that sounds interesting. I'd love to get that link. Hear it again.
Through this in my biblical justice series where I define what type of judgment usually comes in response to what type of sin. It's very poetic. So in this case, we have a clear indication from scripture in Genesis chapters.
Steve Kalati, Biblical Justice.
6 and chapter 7, that the flood came in response to sexual sin, sexual immorality. All right. So when you see sudden floods, especially in an area where it shouldn't be happening, 246 millimeters of rain fell in the space of 10 hours from about 8 o'clock to I think about 6 p.m. in Jeddah. Again, Jeddah is the gateway to Mecca. It's where all the pilgrims come and land. That's where the international airport is. And that airport was shut. You can see the streams of cars coming in, trying to get to the airport, and they're all log jammed. And the flights were delayed. Why? This is the gateway to go and worship and bow down to the biggest idol on the planet, the great rock, the Kaaba, that black cube that everybody goes and then they circle around it. And then they throw stones at the devil. And when they leave, they still pray and bow their knees. They genuflex for 5 times a day, every day. There's nothing else on earth going like it. There's nothing else that draws that much worship and obedience, to a physical object. No other object is like it. And so God sent a sign, a warning. Stop worshiping idols. That breaks the first commandment, the second commandment. Do not worship a physical.
And God done that with COVID as well. Mecca was shut down for months when COVID was on. No Muslim could go to Mecca and go around that black cube. So it was shut then as well.
Object. God is the creator. Do not worship the created. And yet these types of judgments, which used to be warnings for people, are constantly ignored today. I'd encourage you, go back and study the issue of justice, the theme of justice. For all his ways of justice, God says. Deuteronomy 32 verse 4. All his ways are justice, all his ways. So even when a flood like this comes, you got to look and see, what's the justice? God is trying to give mercy and give an opportunity for people to repent. Only 2 people died. Look at the amount of damage that happened. The cars piling one on top of one another. It's unheard of. It's unprecedented. It is record breaking. And the amazing thing is, I was just there, and one of my online church members said, Pastor Steve, it happened again. And I hadn't thought about it, but yeah, it was exactly, this has happened again. God sent me to a place moments before its destruction.
Wow.
It happened when I went down to Texas and I preached in Houston. And then, my goodness, that same place I was standing in preaching was completely flooded and unusable.
Wow.
And judgment came. The strongest hurricane in the history of America came to that place when I went. Same thing happened in Saudi Arabia. And I believe the same thing may happen fairly soon in California. And I've been there to preach. I've declared at Kim Clement's ministry that judgment's going to come on California because of its export, not only sin, but it exports the sin all over the world. And it brainwashes youth and young leaders with thoughts that are absolute lies that God will not tolerate. And so God is going to bring a sign. Don't be afraid. First of all, we don't have to fly into Jeddah, all right? I don't like all of the pilgrims coming in. They're chaotic. They're often rude to each other. It's amazing just watching them. They're coming in to do what is considered one of the top 5 things they're
Because they're aggressive people, Muslims, that's why.
supposed to do as a follower of Muhammad. And yet they come in, and every time I see people in Jeddah, they're yelling and upset with each other and very cranky, really. So it's amazing. You're going towards this cube and you're cranky and you're tense and you're angry. Well, I would say do something else to bring peace into your life and to bring calm and joy into the earth. So watch out for these signs and understand that it's also in the New Testament. This is what Jesus, our Messiah, predicted in the last days. He said in Luke chapter 17, I'm going to start reading in verse 26. And as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be also in the days of the Son of Man. Something like the days of Noah will be like the days of the Son of Man. When Noah's days was full of violence, sexual immorality, and the flood. Water often comes as a sign of judgment against sexual immorality. It's poetic. You know, sexual sin is a sin of fluid, and fluid comes to destroy and take away those who sin with their fluids. So as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be also in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all.
Yep.
So in the same way, time will be up. God will say, I've had it. I've given you warning. I've preached the gospel of Jesus Christ to you through many human messengers, through TV, through books, through tracts that you've received, through church invitations and church services. And now the end has come. So please believe in Jesus before the very end. Put your faith in Jesus. And if you're a believer, start educating yourself on the topic of biblical justice. Learn the different types of judgments that come upon the earth for different types of sins and transgressions. This is very important in the last days because when Jesus comes back, he's not coming back as a savior. He's coming back as the judge and king of the earth. And we welcome him. His justice is our peace. His justice is the punishment of the wicked. He's going to rid the earth of the wicked, the World Economic Forum, the globalists, the New World Order type people that want to control other people. Praise God. Jesus is coming soon.
Okay, I'll go back to Chuck Missler, and until Mike from around the world comes on.
To set aside our misconceptions.
Okay.
Well, I want to welcome you to our final session, the 4th of 4 sessions, on angels, the angelic realm, and specifically the invisible war we find ourselves in. But we started, as you may remember, with angels. Part 1, we had the angelic realm in general. But we started the whole series by emphasizing that the Berean challenge, to set aside our misconceptions. That's often the toughest part in addressing any topic like this. And so we tried to dismiss our misconceptions about angels But what's probably even more important to set aside our misconceptions of our physical reality. And it was pursuant to that we spent quite a bit of time on just pointing out that the physical reality that we find ourselves in is a simulation, is a virtual reality. It's actually a digital simulation. And so that was the first session, major
I wonder how long before it dries up, Han and Diane.
emphasis on that. There's a piece of that first session that I left just as an addendum that we'll talk about here before we get started here in a moment. Then we went to the second session, which was about biblical angels, not the angels you see on Christmas cards or that stuff, but what real biblical angels are, their characteristics and their limitations. And we talked about the specific lineup of Gabriel, Michael. They have very clear job descriptions and so forth. And those two sessions was part one. We are finishing part two, which deals with the invisible warfare we find ourselves in. Session three was what I call the dark side. And that's where we also had to set aside our misconceptions about the word Satan and hell and what do those things really mean. And so we talked about Satan, his origin, his agenda, and his destiny last time. And we also touched upon another strange topic called hybrids, the Nephilim, where the fallen angels somehow created hybrids in an attempt to corrupt the Messianic line. So we went through, we're not through with that topic, by the way. We're going to see modern day echoes of that, we believe. But that was session three last time. So we're in the last session, session four. I'm going to lump in this last session a number of practical considerations. But before we go anywhere else, I wanted to I
will say this, we haven't heard what's happening with that diesel shortage. I haven't heard anything about that for weeks now. And you guys are supposed to be out of diesel by now. So I wonder what's going on there.
And something from session one, and that's an addendum about our metacosm. We decided the macrocosm is finite, not infinite. That's the big discovery of 20th century science. The microcosm is also finite. There's a limit to smallness, and from that we define that we are in our virtual reality is a simulation. That's exactly what Scientific American highlighted in their article back in 2005, that the physical reality we experience is a shadow of a larger reality. And that's exactly what the Bible's presented all along. I want to talk a little bit more about the metacosm, that outside reality, if you will, before we go on, just as an addendum here. We then will go into demons and how they differ from angels, and we'll talk about the...
Yeah, Diane, that's what I mean. We haven't heard nothing about it for weeks. Yet there's only like 18 days left, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, but we've heard nothing.
Age of hybrids that's coming upon us that many people don't realize yet. And then we'll talk about some practical implications of all of this that's gone on. So, but let's just get this little addendum first. There's talk among scientists today about the fact that we may be living in a holographic universe. And that really reflects the thoughts of a David Joseph Bohm, American-born British quantum physicist who contributed heavily to theoretical physics, philosophy, and he was one of the brains on the Manhattan Project, by the way, World War II. And the main idea of a holographic universe really is attributed to him.
Yeah.
That he was the one, he was a protege of Einstein, and he was one of the world's most respected quantum physicists. And his work in plasma physics in the 50s was considered a landmark. He comes from the plasma background, which you can tie back to some of the things I highlighted back there. The whole idea that he noticed that plasmas, electrified gases, behave as organic wholes. Millions and millions of particles seem to know what all the other particles are doing, is the point. And that preoccupied him. When he moved to Princeton in 1947, continuing his work with Einstein there on the behavior of oceans of particles, noting that they're highly organized overall effects and behaving as if they knew what each of the untold trillions of them were doing. Strange idea. Because of his sense of the importance of interconnectedness, as well as his years of dissatisfaction with the inability of the standard theories to explain the phenomena they're dealing with, left him searching. Einstein was the same way. Einstein went to his death frustrated over these same issues. While at Princeton, Bohm and Einstein developed a supportive relationship, shared their mutual restlessness regarding the strange implications of what was then current quantum theory. Bohm's interpretation of quantum physics indicated that at the subquantum level, location ceases to exist. All points in space become equal to all other points in space. And it was meaningless to speak of anything being separate from anything else. Physicists call that property non-locality, if you will. And one of Bohm's startling suggestions is that the tangible reality of everyday lives is really kind of an illusion, like a holographic image. And see, underlying this is a deeper order of existence, a vast and more primary level of reality that gives birth to all what we think of as objects. Bohm calls this deeper level of reality the implicate or enfolded order. The level of our existence he calls the explicate or unfolded order. Those are just his vocabulary indicating there's two levels of existence here. To understand him a little better, he suggests the universe is really a hologram. Let's take a look at a hologram. I might mention, I had personally had the opportunity to visit Emmett Leith. He's the scientist that took the concept of a hologram and added the technology of a laser to create three-dimensional photography in his laboratory at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Back in '64, I actually had a chance to meet him there, and I visited him there when I was back in that era. But anyway, holography is a very provocative transform. Let me see if I can communicate. If you take a piece of photographic film, you place in front of that a three-dimensional object, and you flood a laser beam on that photographic plate, and at the same time also put an object beam on the article. What gets recorded on the photograph, there's no lenses there, by the way. What gets recorded on the photographic film is the interference, if you will, of the two waves. The reference beam and the object beam commingle there to give what mathematically is a Fourier transform of the image. When you take that film and process it, you think it looks like a darkroom mistake. It was just a great piece of film. Until you shine the reference beam on that thing, and that piece of film becomes a window into a three-dimensional world. And so what you do here, the plate becomes a Fourier transform of the image. And what happens if you look at that plate, in just natural light, you don't see anything. When you hit it with a laser that created it in the first place, you actually see a three-dimensional image. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If I was sitting up here and you took a photograph of me from the front, you couldn't tell what kind of tie I was wearing. But if you took a hologram of me, you could move your eye over here and look around this and see my tie. That's what I mean by being a three-dimensional image. And that's the phenomenal, and there's lots of interesting properties of a hologram. I won't get into that all here. We've got other things to do. But what's interesting here is that that window, that hologram becomes a window into a three-dimensional world of some kind, of whatever you want to represent. I'll come back to that in a minute. So it's interesting that many physicists are skeptical of Bohm's ideas. And among those who are sympathetic are some of the brightest thinkers in science. Roger Penrose of Oxford, creator of the modern theory of black holes, is sympathetic to Bohm's view. Bernard Espinat of Paris, one of the leading authorities on the conceptual foundations of quantum theory. And perhaps most interesting, Brian Josephson, the winner of the 1973 the Josephson Junction and so forth. He's a very famous physicist. In fact, Josephson believes that Bohm's implicate order may someday even lead to the inclusion of God within the framework of science, a view which Josephson supports. That in itself is a surprising posture of a guy of his stature in physics. But moving on, I want to tell you about a project that's going on in Germany as we speak, and it's called the GEO 600. Most people in physics are all enamored with what's called the Large Hadron Collider. We talked about that in session 1. This is a different deal. This is in...
Diane, you're right. Australia is very expensive. In the suburbs of Sydney, like the outskirts of Sydney, houses are going for $1 million, which is probably about 800,000 US.
Germany.
And that's in the suburbs, way out in the suburbs.
There's a search for gravity waves. They're trying to find gravity waves. And these are extremely small ripples in the fabric of space-time. And so They were predicted by Einstein back in 1916, but they've never been directly observed. And that's what they're trying to do, is find out, do these things really exist or not? And it aims at the direct detection of gravitational waves by an interferometer, a very strange one. Now, this instrument and its associated detectors are one of the most sensitive gravitational detectors ever designed. They're designed to detect relative changes in distance on the order of 10 to the minus 21. In other words, about the size of a single atom compared to the distance of the Earth to the sun. You can get some grasp of the spread of sensitivity. It's incredible. Well, it turns out, and I won't get into the mechanics here, they've been working on this for some years, obviously, but in January of 2009, it was reported in New Scientist that some yet unidentified noise was present in the GEO 600 detector. And they're beginning to suspect that this might be due to some quantum fluctuation of space-time. And it was one of the scientists from Fermilab in Illinois that wrote a letter to him that suggested that might be fluctuations might have been motivated by holographic principle. It may be that the GEO 600 has discovered something far more valuable than what they were looking for, if that's true. And apparently the gravitational wave detector in Hanover may have detected a holographic universe. This may be it turns out this might be a confirmation of Bohm's ideas. Can the GEO 600 hear quantum noise of spacetime is the question. And are we living in a holographic universe is the fundamental question. This pulls the rug out from most of what we think about astronomy and elsewhere. Is space and time grainy in a sense? Is quantum noise in spacetime is the point. That means that distant galaxies may be nothing more than an illusion. We already know that the galaxies beyond our solar system are not gravitationally linked. They're electrical in the first place. That was the big discovery that we covered in our study about beyond Newton and all that. Yeah. So if this hologram, if the universe is a hologram.
Hey, B, you're in Queensland, aren't you?
And it's like a window in a virtual three-dimensional space. So the things that we see in the outer regions may be virtual, not real. So. The distances in a hologram are synthetic, not real. And so that changes everything. The whole field of astronomy is on quicksand in a sense.
Geez,
to the extent jump. That this matrix, that Bohm's perceptions are on the mark here. So is there a literal fulfillment coming? The scripture says a strange verse, Mark 13, Matthew 24. And the stars of heaven shall fall, and the powers that are in heaven shall be shaken. Most of us take those phrases idiomatically. We can't really visualize all the stars, universe, falling on the earth. That's an anachronism in modern thinking. Unless Bohm is right. You see, that could be very literally occurring. It's just a possibility. Well, having said all that, let's go ahead and jump into the rest of the real meat of session 4. I want to talk about demons and their agenda and the age of hybrid that's coming, and then some practical stuff for all of us. Let's talk about demons. That's a term we use very loosely. Biblically, one of the secrets in Bible study is to be very precise. And demons are not the same thing as angels. And so we want to understand their limitations, and we also want to understand their agenda. What are these creatures? Are they just idioms for what we consider psychiatric illusions? Or are they sentient, real beings, is the question before us. Well, we want to understand their capabilities and limitations, and we want to see how they contrast with angels, fallen or otherwise. And if so, we want to understand our need for what I call spiritual hygiene. And so we're going to talk about the encounter at Gadara on the east side of the Galilee. There have been a number of occasions where demons are encountered in the New Testament. And they're very consistent in many respects. But the most illuminating one is what happened at Gadara. So we'll take it as our exemplar here. And it's recorded in Mark 5 and Matthew 8. We'll take the Mark account.
Okay. Yeah, he actually said what time.
Chapter 5.
That's fine. 1. Thanks, Diane.
And they came over to the other side of the sea, unto the country of the Gadarenes. And by the way, some of the other Gospels make reference with the slightly Gazarenes or Gergesenes. Those are all different. Manuscripts have slightly different ways of designating the same area, by the way. So don't let that throw you. And also the Matthew account speaks of two guys there, but Mark focuses on one specific of the two. So there's a debate among scholars whether there's two different incidents. No, it's probably just that one is it's a different focus, which is really a corroboration, by the way, of the records. But let's go on here. And they came over to the other side of the sea, unto the country of the Gadarenes. And when he was come, Jesus, that is, when he was come up out of the ship, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no man could bind him, no, not with chains, because that he had been often bound with fetters and chains, and the chains had been plucked asunder by him, and the fetters broken in pieces, neither could any man tame him. So this is a tough hombre. And always night and day he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus afar off, he ran and worshipped him, and cried with a loud voice and said, What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? That's a startling announcement from the demon, because he hadn't announced that yet. This is only Mark 5. It's early in his ministry. He said, What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God that thou torment me not. For he said unto him, Come out of the man, thou unclean spirit, according to Jesus, of course. Now, if we switch to the Matthew account, this is one verse I want to pick out of the Matthew account because it records it slightly differently. It says, And behold, they were two of them. They cried out, saying, What have we to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of God? Art thou come hither to torment us before the time? There's a subtlety in the Matthew account that highlights something. They apparently understood they had a destiny of ending, and they just felt it was too soon. The fact that they had a sense of a destiny is provocative here. They have a knowledge that they're evidencing here, is my point. But what are we to do with Jesus, the Son of God, and so forth? So they identify who he actually is, and they are aware of their own destiny. So this is not some kind of psychiatric problem here. And he asked him, What is thy name? Jesus asked him, What is thy name? And he answered, saying, My name is Legion, for we are many. And we're going to discover how many are there shortly. And he besought him much that he would not send them away out of the country. Now there was there nigh unto the mountains a great herd of swine feeding. Now understand, this is on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. That's the Decapolis. That's
Yeah, don't lie, I got VB. You're right.
Greek area. Otherwise, you wouldn't find swine.
You guys.
Area. But this is a very Greek Hellenized area. So there were swine being herded there. And all the devils, there's a plurality of them here involved, all the devils besought him, saying, Send us into the swine, that we may enter into them. Strange situation. These demons are requesting permission to enter the swine. Now, your first question is, okay, why? But even more so, why did Jesus give them permission? And my presumption is in order to demonstrate to us that they're real. This is not an illusion. This is not a hallucination of the
good pickup.
And so, anyway, and forthwith, Jesus gave them leave.
Mum gets mad if I drink too much.
And that mystifies many scholars. And why did he give them leave? Well, anyway, and the unclean spirits went out and entered into the swine. And the herd ran violently down a steep place into the sea, and were choked in the sea. And there's a little parenthesis here. There were about 2,000. That's a lot of demons. That's a lot of demons. The demons obviously have no volumetric constraints. And they that fed the swine fled and told it in the city and in the country. And they went out to see what it was that was done. And they came to Jesus and see him that was possessed with the devil and had the legion, sitting and clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. They were terrified. See, they knew about this guy, and to realize that change, that disturbed them, obviously, understandably. And they that saw it told him how it befell to him that was possessed with the devil, and also concerning the swine. And what do the owners of the herds say? they began to pray him to depart out of their coasts. They wanted him out of town.
Ah,
On the one hand, you can be critical of that. On the other hand, you can understand it. That's their livelihood.
Mum's taking the Fifth Amendment, Diane. In front of your court, she's taking the Fifth Amendment. She drinks more than me, so it's no good asking my mum.
I want to focus on the declaration of the demons here. They announced what was not known at that time. They acknowledged his deity. They recognized his deity. They knew Jesus, who Jesus was.
Yeah, I'm better than the
They also
first
knew their
day.
own destiny. And they also knew he had
I reckon if I have an early night tonight and give my voice a rest, my voice will be back to normal tomorrow with a bit of luck.
control of it. That tells us a great deal. That tells us that these creatures are sentient, have personalities, have issues.
Thanks for asking,
This
AB.
is not a fabrication. It's not an idiom for psychiatric problems here. Demons are different than fallen angels. Fallen angels can materialize. Okay, we'll get back to that in a minute. Demons are under Satan's control.
I can't. Mum and Gabe's gone to the club because they got their Christmas show on. Like there's entertainment and that. They have a Christmas sort of thing. So Mum and Gabe are out drinking. It's not my cup of tea. I don't like to go and watch old men sing some enchanted evening. Not my cup of tea.
And are some of his resources. They are malevolent. They are dangerous. And if you're not a Christian, you are vulnerable
No,
to
yeah,
them.
it's not a cold, AB.
They are not simply some kind of psychiatric disorder. It's a mistake to come to that conclusion. And someone who's properly trained in psychiatry will spot the difference and handle it accordingly. I've been in those situations. It's also interesting to realize that the demons couldn't even indwell an animal without permission. That's provocative. There's some comfort in it.
Yeah, they do.
And now the nature of angels. This is a review from our previous session in session 2. They usually appear in human form, and they're usually masculine. Obviously, always masculine. Sodom and Gomorrah is a good example. At the resurrection and the ascension, we always see a duet giving testimony. They spoke. They took men by the hand. They ate meals. Angels can materialize. Demons can't. That's one of the big distinctive differences. Angels are capable of direct physical contact. That's what the Passover in Egypt was all about. That's what the slaughter of the 185,000 Syrians that we looked at in session 2 was all about. Jacob wrestled with one of these, so they can be tangible. They don't marry. That is in heaven. They don't marry, and when they're unfallen, let's not limit the technology available to fallen angels. That's a whole other subject. In contrast with demons, demons are powerless without a host body. They're always seeking embodiment. When they do have a host, they have superhuman strength. And I've witnessed that. They know their destiny. We saw that, and that's why we picked the one from Gadara, because it illuminates a great deal of that. Some people suspect, we don't know this, but there's a very commonly held conjecture among some of the scholars that they represent the disembodied Nephilim. We know that the hybrids were created in Genesis chapter 6, and they drowned in the flood. But what happened to their spirits? The disembodied spirits are ineligible for resurrection, according to a passage in Isaiah. And so we suspect that the demons are the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim of Genesis 6 and following. But that's a speculation. There's no way to really nail that biblically. That's a speculation. But they do require permission for.
I didn't know that. I thought it was biblically true that the demons were disembodied giant spirits. But he just said it's not actually, it's an accepted wisdom, but it's not actually biblically proven, which I didn't realize.
Whatever they do, even entering animals. And that leads to a topic what's called in the trade an entry. Individually,
Yeah.
the demons need an entry.
Diane, I checked about 5 minutes ago, and that's why I wrote Paul's still doing his shtick. He had his own music on.
And we inadvertently may grant them an entry through our volitions. And that's why certain kinds of practices are dangerous, because they can open the door
I bet he ignored it, Diane.
for entries. To give you one of the best examples, William Blatty wrote a novel called The Exorcist. And my dear friend Walter Martin set out to debunk him, and was shocked to discover when he did his homework that William Blatty had done his homework, that his novel, The Exorcist, was based on several key case studies in New Jersey. It was a boy, not a girl, in the real one, but the point is, Blatty had done his homework. And Walter was quite startled to realize that he had done his homework. But the point is, that whole episode started with a kid fooling around with a Ouija board, and that constituted an entry. And so we need to recognize lowering the gate of your volition can be dangerous, and we want to understand that as we go here. So what can be an entry? Occult games, occult practices. That's why it's dangerous to dabble in the occult. It's not harmless superstition. It can be entries. That's what makes Halloween such a dangerous holiday in certain parts of the world. Role-playing games can be dangerous. Seances, participating in a seance, can be dangerous. And any kind of false
I bet he
worship
ignored
and so forth. There's a whole, we'll get into some of these things later here. There's another strange thing about demons that's less certain but provocative, and that's the territoriality. You would think a spirit being would not be limited geographically, but there's biblical hints that they have zones of influence, and that's an enigma. Question: what does the Golan Heights, Hebron, and the Gaza Strip have in common geographically? These are all...
We knew this from a video we done yesterday. They are the areas that Joshua didn't conquer the Nephilim.
Areas that Joshua failed to exterminate the
There you go.
Rephaim in. There were 4 tribes that he was instructed in Joshua 15 and elsewhere to wipe out every man, woman, child of certain tribes. When you read that as a New Testament reader, you're shocked. But that's what he was supposed to do, and he didn't quite finish in several areas. In fact, these areas. If you do a study of Joshua and Judges, you'll notice there's certain strongholds that Israel failed to defeat completely.
Yeah, Diane, he was implying you must give it to a church or a pastor or something, because apparently Hen helps out the homeless when she passes them by. I've done that myself, no big deal. But that's doing good. That's helping the poor and the homeless. And he's saying don't do it.
And they were the Golan, they were the area we call the West Bank, and an area called Gaza. And Jenin, Nablus, and Walla. In fact, Jericho means the house of the moon god, and that's the capital of the PLO, by the way. Moon god, which of course is the worship centroid of Islam. And so these are territories that remain in spiritual dispute to this very day. Very provocative. Is there a linkage? Who knows? We'll move on here. When Jesus is hanging on the cross, as recorded in Psalm 22, he says, many bulls have compassed me, strong bulls of Bashan have set me around. Scholars wonder what on earth is it. Certainly not talking about literal bulls of the Golan up there. No. The word there in the Hebrew it can be used of men, angels, or animals. It's also metaphorically of enemies or princes or objects, and it may be demon. It's my presumption
It's
that it
angels.
is alluding to demon hosts that are surrounding the cross.
Angels.
His ordeal. But I want to switch now to another topic that we can't even begin to summarize in a brief survey, but I'd be remiss by not including it in some sense.
Cool.
And that's an age that's coming upon us that the secular world will be calling the age of the hybrids. What are they talking about? Are they including UFOs? Probably not. I'm going to include them in our review here. And I want to talk about technology convergences that are accelerating and are going to impact.
Hey, Trace, good to see you.
A few years, not a few decades. And we're talking, what do they mean when they talk about the transcendent man? What's all that about? First of all, let's talk about UFOs. Jesus said, as the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. We can't really understand what he's talking about unless we understand what the days of Noah were all about. And we get that all in Genesis 6. And Genesis 6 is all about these strange hybrids that the fallen angels had contrived. So is it possible whatever was going on in Genesis 6 apparently will characterize the time of the second coming of Christ? That's his remark. And so there are when you get to UFOs, there's a basic problem in that they follow, they leave physical evidences. Burnt ground, radiation, they leave physical, they also show up on multiple radars simultaneously. So they have some kind of physical existence on the one hand. On the other hand, they violate physics laws. They make right angle turns at high speeds. They go faster than the speed of sound without sonic booms. They're a mystery in that regard. And that contradiction is what has puzzled science.
Oh, that's a good pickup. I never thought about that before. They go quicker than the speed of sound with no sonic boom. Wow, good pickup, Chuck.
All along. And then we also, whenever I'm in a large audience and there's an open question answer, because Dr. Mark Easton and I published a book on alien encounters, we're well known in that area, people always ask, what really happened at Roswell? Something very, very strange happened at Roswell, New Mexico, back in 1946, 47 time period. And now the problem with Roswell is severalfold. The Air Force issued one after another of cover stories that are so flagrantly phony that just made it worse, because they kept issuing these bizarre cover stories that were clearly lies. And again and again and again, that fed people wondering what on earth really happened at Roswell. Let me tell you the real mystery. The stories that there were some alien aircraft, there was an alien craft that landed with several bodies in it. One was still alive. They sealed the area off and shipped all that to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base into the deep security that was surrounded it. Now, what really happened at Roswell is the most common question I get. 2 presidents and 4 congressmen have built their careers trying to break that and have not been able to break the security that's around. The mystery of Roswell is why, to this very day, that area enjoys a security classification that's higher than our most sensitive warheads. The question is why? You can't get an answer to that, and that's really been attacked a number of different ways. But what makes this more complicated is that we had a very interesting thing occur. There was one of the first press releases by the Air Force was by General Ramey. He had a press conference where he denounced the fact that this was an aircraft, or whatever, and the press was there. Well, it turns out the press took some pictures, and that was in 47. Well, a few years ago, a researcher by the name of David Rudiak, was able to get hold of those negatives from the newspaper and put digital enhancement on them. And it turns out that while General Ramey was having his press conference, he was clutching a crumpled paper in his hand. And it was possible by digital enhancement to read some of the phrases on the memo that was in hand. And they could read the victims of the wreck and the disc they will ship. A couple of phrases came out of them. So the point was, it was clear that Ramey was holding a confirmation that he was denying in the press conference. Some people call that the smoking gun. So all we really know is the Air Force was lying through their teeth. Something weird was going on that they were trying to cover up. And to this day, there's been one cover up after another, and each one is sillier than the previous one, which just makes the whole situation worse. But that leads to another issue that I want to talk about briefly so you can understand something here. There was a group called Majestic 12 that surfaced in the consciousness of the researchers. Apparently, it appears that Harry Truman, president at the time, in 1946, signed a memo empowering 12 people, 6 civilians and 6 military, into a commission called Majestic 12, 12 people, and he assigned them the responsibility to deal with this whole UFO area, to research it and so forth. Well, the Majestic 12,
I'll show you, Trace.
Before long. But a few years go by, and the memo that Harry Truman signed, and some very elaborate, very negative, is dealing with the handling and disposition of
And there's our Christmas tree. The lights aren't blinking. They're supposed to be blinking.
and those that know it's a hoax. And I mention this because of some background that I want to give you here in this brief review. But there is evidence that MJ12 really does exist in a different name. And the point I want to make, I've spent 30 years in the classified community, and one of the tricks they do, if you're trying to hide something, you let surface some materials pointing to it, surface, that are phony. People quickly find out they're phony, and that discredits the existence of what you're trying to hide. And that's called disinformation. It's a very, very skilled technique widely used within the classified, in the covert ops community. So you just need to understand that. For reasons I don't want to detail here, it doesn't mean I'm correct, but I'm convinced MJ12 does exist and still exists today under other names. And so you just, that's my
Thanks, Trace.
indication of that is the fact that the whole area of Roswell is still to this day classified. It's been over 60, going on 70 years ago. Why? Why can't that be told? And it's very, very well hidden. And so this leads to another area that's very complicated, and that's the area of people that have apparently had abduction experiences. And this is a very complicated.
Okay, we'll go over now.
I don't want to.
Thanks, Di.
No, that's. I was going to tell people you can get the music CD on Harmonize and Prop Center, or you can just get the flash drive. You can order the flash drive. You get the entire album on there. Because some people they just use the flash drive, put it in their computer, or they put it in their car. Some folks they don't even have a CD player anymore. They just have these. And they just put them in there for the car or their stereo in your house. So you can get these too. So you can have the music CD or you can have the music flash drive. Either way, it works just perfect. Yeah, we are anticipating that Mike's going to help us tonight to understand these solar flares, the solar storm. But, the earthquakes, the volcanoes, the asteroids, the meteorites, all these things. Now, he covers this stuff. He talks about it by showing the map that has never been seen before in the webinar tomorrow night at 6 o'clock. You'll be able to watch that, as well as Marshall Masters, Stephen Benanoon, and Gil Brazard. These guys are all amazing. There's even three of us in a panel. Myself, Marshall Masters, and Steve Benanoon did a three-way panel discussing things and debating a little bit. I think you'll find that fascinating. But yeah, and Mike's presentation is off the hook, and he drops a ton of bombs on us. Tonight, I don't know what he's going to drop on us. To be honest with you, I don't know. Did you see his Patreon he did, though? I interviewed him for my Patreon. It was incredible. He did 20 minutes on the UFO disclosure. Tonight, we're going to find out what Mike wants to discuss here, but certainly the solar flare, the solar storm, and what it may mean, and how come the sun is getting this volatile? Is it because of what we are anticipating, this binary system? Have we come to this point of no return? And just how bad will it get? I mean, just how bad will it really get when it comes to this effects of these geomagnetic storms, and how much danger are we in? And I don't wonder about this Elon Musk's Starlink satellites. Will they be able to handle what's about to take place? There's a lot here. So we're going to be asking Mike about that. Some of you want to know, can you tell us who was in the coffin? I think Mike has said several times he's not going to tell you that until it happens, but he's told you it's going to be significant. And when it happens, everyone's going to know. You'll know that was the moment. But he may have some other bombs he's going to drop on us here tonight. So we want to be prepared for that. I just know this. What about the situation? We haven't even talked about it, but the wars, the rumors of wars. We have serious problems going on right now. And they're even now talking about dividing the land of Israel. Did you see that? The United Nations voted yesterday 154 to 9
I hope we were one of the
to hold a
9.
peace summit in Moscow. And to solve this peace summit is not to solve the Russia-Ukraine war, but to solve
Israel-Palestinian conflict. And the United Nations voted 154-9 to set up a summit in 2023 in Moscow, Russia, of all places, when a war is going on, to bring world peace. I'm just stunned by this kind of stuff. I really am. I'm just a little stunned by it all. I just don't understand it. But it's not for me to know. It's really not for me to know. So we're waiting for Mike around the world to be joining us any moment. This would be a good time to get your ticket ordered. Go to my website at paulbaileyprophecy.com and order your ticket for the webinar tonight. And joining us right now from somewhere, some undisclosed location, somewhere around the world, it's Mike from around the world.
I bet you, Pastor Paul, how do I sound?
You sound good to me. I was just telling him all I have is my cell phone tonight. I don't have the system to plug you in direct. I think they'll be able to hear you. You sound good, though. I hear you pretty good, so they should be able to hear you.
Good, good. Talk louder if needed. I'll just,
Yeah, yell a little bit.
let it rip.
Okay. How are you tonight, Mike?
Good. Quite busy. How do you like the sun?
That's what it's making me nervous, Mike. I mean, the sun exploding.
It's doing its thing. We're going to have, I guess you could say this is preliminary, because we'll have at least, I suspect we'll have at least 4 or 5 Carrington events back to back here shortly.
No way.
As things get worse, we'll surpass
10 Carrington events.
That time. It'll be far worse than that.
No way.
So when you say Carrington events, and that happened, of course, 1859, we talked about that earlier in the show. For you to make a statement, you suspect we'll have 4 or 5 of them back to back to back. Why? I mean, are you saying the sun is going to go completely insane?
Oh yeah, we're starting to have, I guess, collectively major disruptions. How the celestial mechanics operates. So it's going to get, it's going to get pretty rough. It's going to be a rough ride. It's a gradual process, but if you notice, when it takes hold, it keeps repeating itself, right? So the frequency at which these things are happening is getting, that number is getting higher and higher. In this case, we're having more and more things take place. Just all sorts of things are taking place. And the time span is very short for those things. And it's increasing. It's increasing like somebody is, the volume is being turned up or something. So it's just, one of those things you can expect. And of course, I believe the biblical aspect of it, boy, there's so many things one cover and unpack in that.
Yeah.
But we are, oh boy. I was just looking at, doing a little nosy about taxes. I was looking at taxes. I was reminded of something very old, because the world really did not have taxes until Egypt.
Okay.
In Egypt, during the time of Moses, taxes were, right before his time, taxes were enabled to keep Christians from giving anything to God. That's what taxes were for.
To steal the tithe. To steal their tithe.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was for. It was to keep them from sacrificing to living God. And then that was one individual that did that. And as a result of that, when they stopped doing that, Egypt had a bit of prosperity until a secondary pharaoh came in. And then he stopped worshiping some of the pharaoh gods, and everything started to fall apart, which made their taxation even more important. And of course, that was adopted in Rome also. And if you look back at some of the topics, of course, in the papyrus, you can find that in the Hadith papyrus in Egypt. But in Rome, it was documented much like we document things in Congress. They did the exact same thing, and it was all to keep Christian worship leveled out.
Well, that's partly what the devil wants to do. Is he tries to attack one way to attack the gospel is attack the finances of the gospel. And
Right.
and it's not just that it's attacking the finance of the gospel, but it attacks people's blessing. Because
right.
the blessing says, if you give, it shall be given unto you. You know, if you steal
Gee, Paul, how can I give you money, mate? You've convinced me.
people's
No.
blessing away, then you keep them in slavery and in poverty. They're no longer the head, but they are the tail.
But I think a lot of people can't recognize we're right back. I know a lot of people think we have evolved past those points, but think of something. Most people work very, very hard for their house, for their clothes, for food, right?
Right.
And they don't have any more money, right? And so the same mentality is back again as it was in Egypt right before the Exodus, where people are working to stay alive. They just don't see it that way. It's not marketed that way, right? They really think they're living in a type of paradise, but in truth, it's almost like a unseeable control system that will have.
You still there, Mike?
No.
Mike, are you still with
And
us?
believe me, people fight each habit just like they did in the past.
Yeah, there will be, and you just got silence there for about 10 seconds, Mike. But you're hitting.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Go figure.
Yeah. Go figure. You're stepping on the big man's toes. Who is the big guy? Anyway.
Yeah, but it's happening. You know, it's happening again at a time when a lot of weird things are happening, Pastor Paul. I mean, a lot of strange things are happening.
What do you think about this,
frequent.
Mike? And we'll get back on the sun here in a minute. And when you said 3 or 4 Carrington events in a row, I'm going to ask you, what is that going to do to the earth? But before we do, what do you think about the United Nations yesterday voting? The United Nations General Assembly voted 154 to 9. There's only 10 nations that abstained, I guess. 154 to 9.
I wonder who the 10 nations abstaining were.
To have a peace summit in Moscow, not to solve the Russia-Ukraine war, to go to Moscow and to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And they agreed to do it, 154 to 9. And oh, by the way, I read the rest of it was starting with the pre-1967 borders.
Yeah, well, you know what? Moscow is where one of the dedications took place a long time ago with Russia. That seems to be a centric point for very ancient things, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Ancient gods of worship. And believe me, they keep these ancient things fed very well, meaning that they serve the needs of these ancient gods. They do. Moscow was one of those points, and in fact, abortion and a bunch of other things were legalized right there in Russia, and then they spanned all over the U.S. But it seems to be a point where anything that happens spiritually, that is spiritually defiled, starts right there every single time. And I think that due to a lack of history, people don't really understand principalities and powers, that they don't go away. They stay right there. So no matter who comes into power, they're going to be under the rule of some of these spirits, or else they're not going to be in power. I think that's one of the explanations for Putin. I think it is. He has been spiritually overcome. Nowhere in the Bible do I ever read where a person who is put in a specific position, even Solomon hinted at the fact that you had to deal with this. You go into positions of highness. He actually said, appreciate those positions of lowness, because when you go into a position of highness, you have to deal with very ancient things. And it's one of those themes that are echoed throughout the Word of God. That's what you have to deal with. It's like people who have money. Before you have any money, any significant amount of money, you have one spirit. As soon as you get money, you're going to have to deal with the spirit that comes with money.
Right.
I mean, there's a spirit that comes with money.
Sure there is.
And if you're not careful, it can drive a person insane. And the same thing is happening in these places. I do expect them to divide to officially, but in my opinion, I think they've already done it. Because when you have the UN and you have all these people, this happened 2 or 3 years ago. They all decided that Jerusalem should not belong to Israel. Right?
Yes.
This is on paperwork.
Yes.
They decided that in their minds that Israel is already divided, which is why they have an issue making Jerusalem the capital. Right?
Yes. Yes.
Because if they have decided that Israel shouldn't have certain parts of that land, then there you go. And then we read in the Bible where it says that the Lord said they parted his land. Well, that was a prophetic statement looking in hindsight. They're going to do it.
They're going to do it.
And when they do it, that's going to be this. Now, when they do this, that's the exact time when many of the armies are going to be in the Middle East too. But even in the book of Isaiah, when that happens, all the armies of the earth will be destroyed. And so we have an issue, Pastor Paul, because in the Bible it says all the armies of the earth will be destroyed. All of them will be. And which means that everybody takes this position against Israel. And a lot of people, I remember on your show, Pastor Paul, about 5 years ago, there were lots of people who said, well, the U.S. will never do that. Well, nobody's in a rush to say that now.
No.
We have actually spearheaded many of the talks over the last, 10 years, dealing with Israel being parted and how people have supplemented the sentiment of Israel, having all that land. They tried to supplement by giving them favors, this, that, and the other, to get their mind off that land being parted. And they have really just, they've really done a job. In my opinion, the world has turned its back on everything God has put in place. Everything God put in place, world turned its back as though there is no God, right? They're just this. That's an overwhelming theme. The world, God says, don't part my land. They say, well, what God? There's no God. And they take his authority doing what they want to do. There are repercussions for this. And those repercussions are building. And that's why people don't have the time they think they have. Because many are falling into this mentality that God's not going to do anything. Or that it's just an ancient idea. As a consequence, our youth is corrupted. The world within itself is iniquitous and corrupted, and laws support high corruption against the living God. So how long do people think we're going to last in this condition? Because historically, every time one of those nations that initially worshiped the Lord, who turned their back on the Lord, they were destroyed after they turned their backs. And so the same thing that happened to them is happening to us right now. It's this crescendo building up, and it will take its toll.
You know, you bring out such a great point that they do these things in total rebellion to God. They blaspheme. You know, and it says in the book of Revelation, in the 13th chapter, it starts talking about the beast and this kingdom. It says that they blaspheme. I think it says let's just read a couple verses here where it says verse 5. This is Revelation 13.
See, that's what I'm asking, Diane. Last time they done that, our Prime Minister abstained from the vote. We were one of the few countries, this is only about 4 years ago, that completely backed Israel. So we've got a new government now and they're left. So pretty sure they would have voted to separate the land.
And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. And power was given unto them to continue for 42 months, for 3.5 years. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. Blaspheme, blaspheme, blaspheme. They act as if God's word isn't true, or there is no God. They're not afraid of his consequences. They're in total rebellion, and they're going to bring destruction upon themselves and their nations with this idolatrous, paganist hatred toward God and God's people. And so there's something about Babylon. Yeah. There's something about Magog. There's something about these, Damascus. There's something about the Euphrates. What is going on, Mike, that there's these are the meccas of controversy and evil, Why is it in these certain areas that this stuff just festers?
Those are clearly when the Lord told us we don't war against the flesh, the principalities and powers. It's like a lot of your audience out there. There are people in their lives they would wish would go away, right? Every single person has somebody in their lives that they don't really like. They just don't like that person, and they think that their solution is getting rid of the person. Well, if they look carefully, they'll find this, that every time they get rid of a person like that, the same spirit that spoke through the one person will end up speaking through somebody else the exact same phrases as the one did prior. So they're actually in combat, so to speak, against a spirit, not the person. You get rid of the person, you just hurt the person. The person, free of a spirit, may not understand what they were doing. But if you get rid of that spirit, now you freed the person, got rid of your problem. And once we grab hold of that, good to go. But in these lands, there are principalities and powers that if God spoke about them, and if God said they were there, right, then they're going to be there. They've been doing the same thing since day one, right? Just since day one, in every single culture, the same pattern forms in every single culture in these different places, like clockwork. That can't be coincidence, right? And right before the fall of all these other places, right before the fall, they were in high worship. They were doing the same things we do. They were worshiping these weird gods. They were not sacrificing unto the living God, because God said he's not accepting their sacrifices, because they totally went corrupt. They were going to, in Rome, they were going to Delphi, and in Egypt, they were still doing their thing there. And then places over here in the USA, they were worshiping the snake kings, what they call snake kings, Quetzalcoatl, and all these different things. Every single last civilization had a promise.
Why did they have
there came a time, Pastor Paul, when they said their deities were exiled.
No way.
And it's because I think that when a lot of people are looking for a type manifestation of these ancient entities, they missed one thing. The manifestation of an entity is through the flesh of mankind. Mankind does the bidding of those entities. That's why every single entity had some sort of priest that a person will go to and speak to the priest.
So we're some kind of a host? I mean, we basically become the host for these entities?
Right. Collectively.
Yeah, collectively, yeah.
Collectively. And so, Jesus got rid of all this stuff. He did, because everything collapsed around 2,000 years ago. Everything did. And all of a sudden, it's all coming back. Right? It's being pushed by media strongly. And the one thing that gets me is that, is it coincidence? Are we looking at some sort of spiritual development and prophetic development of revelation? Because have you noticed that with iniquity comes a rise in these psychics on television, comes a rise in people necromancing or talking to the dead?
Yes.
These things are like clockwork. They're going hand in hand. And the worst part about it is many Christians, they won't say anything about it. They won't. Because let's go ahead and face it. A lot of people are frightened of consequences. They're frightened to lose the one asset they have to take care of their families, which is money. Right? Yeah. And I'm telling you, a day is coming where we're going to have to make a choice. God requires a choice by the heart. He takes care of the rest. Wow. But that takes trust to actually walk in that path in that direction and not panic. And so it's coming down to that point because.
Wow, and that's crazy. We love Satan. Wow, things are getting really bad when kids are doing that.
Christians are going to get a wake-up call when they find out that the earth is not sustaining like they thought it was. We have some severe things forming in the earth. They're not going to back down. They're getting worse. We're going to have times of reprieve, like I would say right now. Right now, we're at minimal activity in the earth right now. Watch, it won't last 3 or 4 more days. It will not last 3 or 4 more days until everything goes back on a cycle again. And it's going to keep doing that. And the frequency of those intense cycles will be more and more and more. Just watch and see. And this will go hand in hand with man's decisions, their collective agreement to move away from all things of the Father. It's going to show in all these geological processes when they start going upside down. And every time man comes up with an explanation, a scientific explanation, something else is going to happen that they don't understand.
You can't get ahead of God. And it just keeps, every time, whatever we reap what we sow. And like you said, every time we think we got something figured out, God shows you haven't got anything figured out. Behind me is of course, the volcano, the largest volcano in the world over there in Hawaii. And you're looking at the rivers of magma flowing down the mountain. I think it has come less now. It's almost 2 miles away from the big highway. It's going to cut that island off. People are going to be, well, they'll have to drive around the entire rim of the island to get from one place. Some folks have to drive 4 hours, and that's if the traffic's not bad. And so obviously the traffic's going to be worse. So tell me, Mike, what's going on with this volcano in comparison to other volcanoes? It's a big one. And why did it take 38 years when it was averaging about every 5 or 6 years?
Well, as of late, we've been having more and more internal processes of the earth kick up more and more magma. More rock is being melted. But I'll tell you right now, that's not enough. I know that looks bad, but we need that plus a lot more to relieve some of the pressure in the earth, right? If the pressure is not relieved in the earth, and maybe Hawaii will become an example of that. I hate to say this, but they have more than that volcano, right?
Yeah.
If that gets corked, so to speak, if that gets clogged up, Pastor Paul, there's still massive pressure in that area. It's going to come up through something, right? So instead of one going off, right, you're going to have major eruptions in that place. We're talking about some severe, just insane, obscene pressures.
What?
Lots of pressure. And this volcano, if it were letting out a whole lot of magma and it looked really bad, I could exhale, right? It's not trickling out lava. This is a trickle.
No
It's
way.
not enough to relieve the pressure that's built up underneath it. You'll notice in a couple of days that they're going to have tremors around that place, right? You're going to notice tremors around that place. That means that the magma is trying to find new avenues, that pressure is trying to equalize. This volcano, it's just not enough. It's not enough to equalize it. We have a solar flare, and then NASA's also watching some other spots. We know that the Earth will absorb all that radiation from these solar flares. That's going to go right into the poles and heat the Earth even more, turning more rock into magma, and magma potentially into gases, causing more pressure buildup inside the Earth, and then poof. We don't have relief points. We need more eruptions to relieve some of the pressure in the Earth. In fact, the pressure ratio of the Earth has risen in the last 10 years, meaning it's like blowing up a balloon. Imagine if you could blow up a balloon, right? Air was constantly going inside of a balloon. What you would end up having to do is poke little holes in it. And let's just say that if you poked holes in it, it did not explode, right? Air would just seep out these little holes. But say every year the air increased going into the balloon, you would have to poke more holes into it, correct? To equalize the pressure. Otherwise, the whole thing's going to expand, and then it would explode. This is what the Earth is doing right now. Every year, the Earth is taking in more and more radiation, right? From our magnetospheres, it's redirecting all high-speed charged particles to the north and the south pole. That's the aurora. And as it goes inside the Earth is just building up an enormous amount of energy, and it has nowhere to go. So that translates into heat. That heat is melting rock. That rock is the magma that you see, right? So the Earth is vibrating. It's shaking, these earthquakes, and we have lots of eruptions right now, but it's not enough to let out the pressure that all the crustal plates won't crack to pieces. If we don't have more eruptions, we're going to be in big trouble. We need some big eruptions.
What? Are you
not
serious?
Equalize, and it will crack.
So, okay, so as you mentioned this solar flare, it's a big one. It's hitting us right now and going to be hitting us through the night and tomorrow. It's a big one. So you're saying that thing is so powerful, it's going to do some serious heating up of the core. Do you expect an earthquake? I kind of think that maybe in the next 24 to 48 hours, we might see a big earthquake, or maybe it's a big explosive volcano, or both. Do you anticipate something from this pressure?
Well, think of a nuclear bomb, right? When a nuclear bomb goes off, once the reaction begins, it is quite explosive, correct? Same thing happens as radiation is redirected into the poles. The same thing happens inside the Earth. You're looking at a large yield of nuclear weaponry inside the Earth every time we have one of those solar flares. Now, the difference is this, though, that this energy coming from the sun is polarized, which means the Earth can handle it, right?
Okay.
But what happens if you take 2 car batteries and you connect positive to positive, or negative to positive, positive, negative, you get a kapow, right?
Right.
You hook them up the other way, you don't get a kapow. You get 2 batteries in parallel. That means they can take one another, right? That's what it means. When you have them in parallel, they just share the energy. When they're out of phase or they're opposite contacts, that energy is going to flow twice as fast through both batteries, destroying both, right? If the Earth is ever polarized with a solar flare, and it can be a lot smaller. What we're having now is CME, whatever the case is, it can be a little tiny one. If the Earth is not in the right polarity, right, we're going to have damage that people won't understand. That's one element. This rarely talked about. The Carrington event, they know it was not polarized, which is why it was so devastating. But if the Earth had been in an opposite polarity, the Carrington event would not have happened. People think it's the size of the flare that causes the damage. No, it isn't. It's the polarity of our magnetosphere. That's what it is.
Now, is CERN
can either absorb an energy or can instantly repel it, right? Magic and repel it. If it absorbs all, or if it repels all of it abruptly, it can't do that. It's going to cause this reaction nobody wants to see. And that's where the damage comes from. That's when electricity and plasma actually flows across the surface of the Earth. But if it's polarized just right, it will absorb all the radiation the sun puts out, all of it.
So let's say I'm the magnetosphere and the sun's releasing this tremendous amounts of pressure. Solar winds are blowing. There's CMEs, corona mass ejections. There's plasma storms. If I can absorb it, as a magnetosphere, I can keep it from doing massive damage to the core of the Earth and to the Earth itself. But isn't our magnetosphere been weakened and I don't want to jump straight to CERN, but I'm concerned about CERN. But what is weakening the magnetosphere?
Think of this, fastball. Here's the if we have a weakened magnetosphere, right?
Yeah.
And say the Earth puts out a large solar flare, right? Now you have one arm pointed toward the sun, which is your absorption arm. You have another arm pointed away from the sun, which is your exhale arm, right?
Okay.
If you have it that way and you're weakened, it doesn't matter. When that solar flare hits you, you're gonna get charged up. You're gonna say, I feel good. If you have your propelling arm facing the sun, right?
Yeah.
And your absorption arm away from the sun, and the sun sends out some little tiny spark of energy, and it hits you, and you're in a strong or weakened state, your arm is going to get blown off.
No!
Now do you understand, right? So if the magnetosphere is polarized, it can absorb everything the sun sends out. If it's polarized right.
Okay.
But if it's not polarized right, Pastor Paul, doesn't matter how strong or how weak it is, we're in trouble. So it's a blessing. It's a blessing. Things have been polarized up until this point. But we have a switching phenomena taking place.
Yeah.
Right?
So
it's just like the chemistry in a lithium battery. If you take a lithium battery below, let's say 0.5 volts, right? Do you not know it's going to start to change its polarity because of chemistry? The same thing is happening to the Earth, which means the wrong arm is going up facing the sun, and it will not matter what size the flare CME is. We're not going to be able to take any of them.
Because we got the wrong arm. We got them crossed. Well, what's causing that? Is that what Planet X is doing? I mean, this binary system, is it messing us up and the sun up?
Here's the other part. The sun, when it sends out solar flares, there's a phenomenon that's been happening for many, many years. Every time the heliosphere is weakened in a certain part around the big sphere going around our solar system, all of a sudden we have a solar flare in that direction, right? That's actually an attraction. So The heliosphere, when it's weakened, demands, it causes almost like a demand of electricity to that certain spot. I'm going to call it electricity. And the sun will shoot a flare in that direction. They have a book of solar flares and directions based upon the heliosphere. And every time a flare goes off, they can check it off because they can predict where it's going to go if they measure that heliosphere and where the weakened parts are. Right? So the sun is actually regenerating a big protective field around our solar system. Now, if another object comes in that has more influence than our sun, it's going to affect the heliosphere, right? It will also affect the whatever half it's coming in on. It's going to affect the entire half, not just a small part, which means solar flares will soon start shooting out in one direction. And when they start doing that, you better believe something is in our proximity enough to cause bad damage. Right? Because we already have external influences coming from somewhere out there. We already have this. And it's going to get worse, more precise. The sun will seem to divert all of its power to one side or the other. And that will be the side we're going to be affected most on of this incoming system.
Wow.
And this is what this has been observed.
Well, now when this happens, Mike, won't the earth heat up? Won't the sun past the magnetosphere and start to scorch men, like it says in Revelation?
We're going to have a photon redirection. Right? Believe it or not, infrared is hot, right? Infrared is hot. So what will stop infrared? What blocks infrared from actually, just boiling the earth? Photons. Photons that light emitting photons, right, can actually cause infrared to curve. It can actually cause infrared to curve. You take away the photons, right? Infrared's going to pour in all directions from the sun, burning up everything it touches. In the case of a secondary system, the photons are redirected towards the inbound star. And that means the light from the sun will curve or be absorbed to that inbound star. When this happens, the sun is still emitting infrared. That light frequency is still going to shoot out, but now we have no protection from it. We don't have protection. We have no reflective protection from it. We have no shielding protection from it. It's going to heat up our atmosphere. It's going to start heating up the atmosphere. It's going to heat up the surface of the earth. And beneath the earth and the waters, we're going to have pressure changes in the water, which means if we had a pressure change right now, the seas would begin to boil on all the coasts without being hot.
So without being hot,
That's right. Without being hot, they would boil.
Because of the magma coming
Because
up.
of a pressure change. That's because of a pressure change. It's just like going into a higher altitude. Your boiling point is different at higher altitudes. So if you change the pressure in the earth, water that's not boiling now, that's maybe it's 60 or 70 degrees, can actually begin to boil if that pressure changes. That means it's going to evaporate. That means, everything is going to start drying up pretty quick, and everything is going straight up in the clouds, which is going to cause some sort of a canopy to be over the earth, which will obscure everything, turning everything red. Because with infrared, now you have that reflectivity caused by the water particles, and everything on earth will look red. Everything.
Wow. Mike from the World's with us tonight, folks, and this is fascinating. So where does CERN, Mike, play into all of this? It is CERN.
I'll say it again, Pastor Paul. CERN does many experiments, right? It's a multinational experiment. Well, they publicize one experiment. That's for money. What has CERN perfected? Their magnets. Out of all of what they're doing, they perfected their magnets. So much so that their magnets affect the magnetosphere. So much so that their magnets can actually redirect solar particles. Now that's something, isn't it?
Redirect right? Solar particles.
Where to?
The solar particles are nothing more than high-speed particles, just like CERN emits, right? They're controlled to go through that tube by magnets. Right? You have to get the magnet technology perfect to guide charged particles. So the miracle of CERN is actually the magnet, something that people never ever think about. I'm sure that there are some very wise people out there where things are starting to click because they're having all these experiments. Yes, they're developing things. Science is going forward, and quantum physics is being, sharpened. But the magnets are a miracle of science, which means the magnets are perfected to such a point that they can actually, if they wanted to right now, they could put a magnetosphere over a city right now with those magnets at CERN. And that what that means is if a nuclear weapon went off, right? How do you protect a city from a nuclear weapon? The same way you protect the Earth from a CME or flare. You have a magnetic shielding that goes over that city, which can redirect all radioactive particles wherever you want them to go. That's the miracle. See, that's what, right there in front of people's faces, they have perfected a technology that is significant. But who's paying attention? Because normally the sensationalism of CERN is, the Higgs boson progress and all these different things, and nobody's looking at the magnets. A lot of money went into those magnets. A lot of money went into that. And I'm telling you now, if you can control a magnetic field, you can redirect all radioactive particles wherever you want them to go. You can divert all the radioactive fallout and everything else from a nuclear weapon, make it go somewhere else, because they're always going to follow magnetic field lines, always.
Wow, I did not even realize that, but it does make sense because it's like energy or like electricity or like energy. It has to flow in the way the current is directed. It's
energy is electromagnetic at its heart. Gravity is electromagnetic at its heart. So those they understand those. Even gravity, the concept of gravity has changed. That was changed 8 years ago permanently, and gravity turns out to be not what they thought it was, but in fact it's magnetic field lines, of course, and it's they call it magnetic memory, which holds particles together. This is one of the things they found out at CERN. Our bodies are held together through magnetic memory, meaning that each particle has assigned to it a magnetic shape. That magnetic shape is passed on from cell to cell, so that every cell is automatically going to be attracted to certain systems based upon that magnetic shape. They call that magnetic memory. Quantum computers can replicate magnetic memory of tiny cell structures containing possibly maybe 200 trillion cells or something like that, which means they have found a way through quantum computers
good to see you.
Order matter. That's what that means. That's a giant breakthrough. I'll say that one more time. Because they found out about magnetic memory, they have taken quantum computing, which is far stronger than any computer that's out here in the world, right? And they can actually utilize that materials and atoms, right? That means they can order material. So if you want
that happens a couple of times. I don't know what it is.
Piece of wood, the key to making wood is not to go get a bunch of wood. It's the matter is all floating around you. All they have to do is
no, something with the TV, and usually it goes a lot longer, and I got to turn the telly off because it sounds like it's going to blow up.
Order how it's put together. That's done through magnetic memory, and only a computer can crunch the numbers enough to direct how these particles are going to assemble themselves. And they have done this. They have done it.
So when they collide these protons in CERN, in that big tube, that tube behind me, folks, is actually 27 kilometers, I think it is, and they're building one that's going to be twice that, or I don't know, 54 kilometers or something.
Oh, they have a big one.
Yeah,
it's a big one.
So they're going to collide these protons at the speed of light, and when they crash, they create new particles.
That's right. They break existing particles down to basic structures, right? In other words, what they do is they crunch the force that's holding matter together, and they break it apart, right? It's like cracking open an egg to see the yolk. They're doing this because the one thing that has stumped everybody is what the world is holding. What powerful force is holding everything together like it is? The human body is made up of matter, right? But guess what? We have more air holes in us than you could. We have more holes in us than matter itself. Isn't that funny? Metal itself, if you somehow had something that you could really look at metal on a small level, you'll find that it's a bunch of particles that do not touch, right? They're just close together. They don't touch.
So we're like
Nothing
a living.
touches.
So you like I'm actually filled with molecules that are floating in the air.
That's right.
And something's holding me. Something's the glue that's
There's a
holding
force.
me
That's
from
right.
just,
That's right.
and that must be a powerful force to hold
That's
everything.
right. So they have been
Praise
breaking
God.
particles down to examine the forces that hold them together, and they have found quite dozens of them so far. And they're
Okay.
trying to. They have successfully replicated some of these forces, which is the magnetic memory. In other words, that force, they can reshape that force. And when you can reshape that force, basketball, that means you can look at somebody's hand, right? If you can record the shapes of that magnetic force between all the matter, all you have to do is replicate the force. The matter is already there, and you cause another hand to be reordered, seemingly out of thin air.
What?
Everything is broken down into the most basic of particles. The assemblage of these particles, right? That determines what the matter is. And further assemblage determines what the molecule is. And further assemblage determines what the matter is. And further assemblage determines other things. So you have to find out what in the world is holding the smallest particle together, right? Once you find that out, they determined that this was electronic at its root. It's dealing with magnetism. That's what it's dealing with. Everything is based on photons and magnetism. You could say that light is holding everything together, right? But within light are some forces stronger than any force anybody has ever encountered. And they've been breaking that down into small, tiny pieces to try and replicate it. If you can order that force, you can recreate matter.
Now, are they trying to do that? Are they trying to pierce the veil? I mean, are they trying to go into another dimension with CERN, or learn how to do it?
I think in part they already have. They're extracting, for example, with quantum computing. When you talk to experts in quantum computing, they will just tell you, if you ask a quantum computer a question, it will give you the answer before you're finished asking the question. How about that?
Say that
So
again.
you ask it one question. If you ask, I'm giving a visual on this. Suppose I asked a quantum computer, when's my next test? It's going to give me, before I finish asking the question, it's going to give me, say, 50 dozen answers before I finish asking the question. And when I get the answers, they're going to be highly relevant to my question. That's what quantum computing does. If you wanted to extract energy or antiparticles from that quantum realm, you're going to get out a lot more than what you put into it, right? So we're not talking about 0-point energy. We're talking about if you put a force into that quantum realm, you're going to get that force times a multiple of thousands coming back your way, right? So
Wow.
As it turns out, that is they're calling this a governing dimension, not this realm of reality, but that dimension is a governing dimension. So where's that powerful force that's holding everything together? Why don't your fingers fall apart? Why don't you fall through your desk? What's holding these molecules together but they're not touching? Are these atoms together, these particles together but they're not touching? So it's on the opposite side. It's a dimension all around us. It is the force that's holding everything together, and it takes quite a bit of tenacity to break that field to see into this. And they want to see into this so they can harness it. And by the way, they already have harnessed it because they have negative particle chambers. Right? They built those in 2021, negative particle chambers. A chamber to house something comparable to an atom is about as big as a cell phone, right? So why would something that holds an atom be as big as a cell phone? Because you're dealing with a lot of power. As soon as you let it go, it's going to go right back to where it came from. And it's just going to stay. There is no force that can actually hold back whatever's ordered in that realm. So what they're doing is trying to manipulate that realm from this realm.
So when God said, when Jesus, I mean, the rich man and Lazarus, and the rich man died, and Lazarus died. Lazarus goes to Abraham's bosom. The rich man goes into hellfire, some type of confined area of torment. But he can see into the other realm. He sees Lazarus with Abraham comforted. And he cries out. Abraham hears him and says, I hear you, but we can't get to you. There's a great gulf fixed. Like, is it like another dimension, another like invisible.
Think of it as an impossibility, not so far as distance, right?
Okay.
But sheer impossibility. It's almost like we're like a fish that wants to touch your finger, but the fish is in the aquarium, right? And the aquarium has a top on it that's glued, but it's impossible for that fish to touch your finger. He can see your finger. He can analyze your finger. He cannot touch it. You just can't touch it. He can get close to it. So the only thing that fish can do is examine it. In CERN's case, what they're doing is examining these exotic particles, their construction, how it, when they split apart matter, how it affects this opposite realm, so they can capture, right, the communication going on between the two. Because if you can manipulate the communication, you effectively manipulate what's on the other side without touching it, correct?
Yeah.
So that's what they're doing. Suppose that fish could give you a false signal that it's hungry. You would feed it and get exactly what it wants by communication. And so CERN is another form of that communication. It's also why they have some of the Indian texts there, because all scientists they're encouraged to study these writings. Why? Because they found that they're based in reality, not mythology. Right? They found the vehicles, they found the stuff, they found the experiments. They know about certain places that nobody should go into. Right? There are certain places on the earth that do exist that were left over from a long time ago. Nobody's going to stumble across these places. These places are guarded, but they do exactly what those books say they do.
So
anybody who goes into these places is not going to come back the same. They're just like, because you could step into a place literally for 1 second and step back in, but to the individual, it will seem like they were there 4,000 lifetimes. Now, do you think that would drive a person insane?
Yeah.
If a person stepped into a place just for a second,
are these like portals? Are these like in Iraq and there's caves and places? I mean, are these like portals almost?
India has most of them. India has most of them. India and places near that desert region and going into China, Mongolia, and all those places, they have most of them. But there are places just like that. There are too many reports coming back of lots of military personnel who have stepped into these places, stepped out fully gray, full beards, skin is wrinkled and everything else. Something went severely wrong. They were only over there. They weren't even fully over there. There are people who have died in these places. In other words, it's almost like something was running and some of the terrain was fake. It wasn't real terrain. And somebody stumbles, unfortunately, into these areas and they get stuck or something. They can't get out. So the only alternative is to kill that person because they'll never get out. Things like that. Weird things happen. Things that are not supposed to. Things that the human brain cannot wrap around. And are they witnessed a lot? You better believe it. But they don't advertise this stuff because people would rather hear about, some ordered thing like E.T. and his spacecraft and how neat he is. He never has toilet paper around, no tissues are hanging on the walls. It's very neat, extraterrestrial. Instead of, the picture that some of these craft are liquid on the inside, just like our bodies. What if people found that out? That a craft, some of these craft that they're so excited about, right? That they have veins in them, that they have blood cells in them, right? That they replenish those craft with sea life and things like that. That would be attractive for it. Everybody would repel what was coming, right? They don't want people to repel what's coming. They want to hide any of the bad stuff so that people say, oh, they're good people. I have a lot of Christians, basketball, that write me and say, listen, Mike, from around the world, I know that the Galactic Federation, that they're nice people, that they're really here to liberate people. These are Christians saying this. Right? And every time I get one of those letters, at first, you think it's from somebody who's not wrapped too tight. But then when you start getting sheer volumes of these emails, you realize you have a lot of work to do because there's a war happening right now. The question is, who's winning this war, right?
So people are being deceived and being...
Yes, they are. And we're talking about Christians who know their Bible.
Yeah, I know.
Who have faith in Christ. But there's some dark things happening. Very dark things happening.
So there's a lot of spiritual aspects involved in these portals, and it's not just dimensional, it's also spiritual.
And I say it's 100% spiritual.
Yeah,
I say that what they're calling dimensional
is actually spiritual.
Like at CERN, why would they have a ceremony with people there, right, with priestly robes on. Why?
Yeah, why would you do that? Why would you have Shiva?
Recreate ancient rites? Why would they go pull stuff from museums to read it at CERN? Why?
Why?
See, and we're talking about this happens in all significant places, not some all. And CERN is just, it's right there in front of people's faces.
They got the goddess Shiva literally sitting out front, for the whole world to see. So, and they do these ceremonies, like you said, which means they're operating in spiritual realms. They're entertaining demonic forces in spiritual realms. Yet this is supposed to be a highly scientific location, and I'm not saying it's not, but somewhere the scientific realm, the scientific world meets a spiritual world.
Pascal, that brings in another point, because a lot of people are about to find out that term, scientific, is a very old Greek term, something that the Grecians actually, for example, the atom, right? The atom, the details of the atom was written about thousands of years ago. So this, if you tell people what science was back then, people would get angry, because science was a term. This pursuit of truth was a term in which magic was used. We call it magic technology. That's what we call it. They call it magic. And they would actually have mechanisms and things like that for their high priests in temples who worshipped these deities, right? So they knew about the roots and the trees. That's why you read the book of Enoch, how that Azazel and all these fallen angels taught people about all different plants, root cuttings, incantations, rituals, and rites, and all these ancient things, science, how to make metals, how metals are constructed, atoms, all this stuff they taught. Well, when they teach science, what do they do to a human being? There's nothing wrong. Like God, in the book of Enoch, God said it wasn't the knowledge that was wrong. It was the timing. Because man, if you give a child an AR-15 and it's loaded, right, what's going to happen?
Well, it's a danger. It could kill itself or kill someone else. Right.
That's right. Somebody's going to die. You're going to destroy God's creation.
Right.
And what happens if you give a 15-year-old an AR-15? Well, a 15-year-old does not have the experience of having killed someone. They don't know the consequence of death itself. They don't know what you deal with mentally. So they don't have enough wisdom to employ that weapon. So they don't know when to employ it, which means they shouldn't have it. They may think they need it, but they have no wisdom to utilize it. The same thing happened with these fallen angels. They gave man premature knowledge. And what did man do as soon as he got that knowledge? He went to war. That's why in the Bible it says they learned war no more. Because with all these breakthroughs that we have, you would think that cancer would be cured. You would think that none of us would have to pay for electricity, water, or air, carbon, or anything else. But that's not the case. What we do with all these discoveries, we don't heal people with it. We destroy nations and we subdue nations with it. That's what people do with it. That's immature. So I get another question. If we're that immature, why would some advanced race ever come here? Why would they do that? That's ludicrous.
I know. Well, it sounds like what's happened is we are professing ourselves to be wise, we become fools. I think Paul said in the Bible, and that he might have meant that in doctrinal ways, but I think actually in a lot of ways we outsmart ourselves. I mean, we exalt ourselves above the knowledge of God, and then we turn on our own selves. We become destructive to our own selves. It's all about power and greed, manipulation, and how to encamp slavery, making people slaves, basically.
That's all they do. We have a nature, Pascal. We can't even help but to do these iniquitous things because we haven't built up spiritually enough or matured spiritually enough to overcome it, to just simply say no to many of these desires that's in the flesh.
Yeah.
And the Lord wanted us to be mature before he presented everything. And this is why we have to be awakened, because if Christians saw something that they thought they'd never see in the heavens, you know what a person would do? The first thing a Christian would say is, I got to get my life right. I can't play around, because they would see something much bigger than anything they ever thought, right? They would see the impossible. with that impossible thing they just saw, they would believe in the possibilities of the word. They would turn back to faith and say, Lord, I need you. I don't know it all. I don't know everything I'm doing here. I need you, Lord. And so we're getting some pretty significant wake-up calls, and they're going to begin fairly quickly, and they will not stop. And just once they start, they're not going to stop. They will escalate.
Mike, tomorrow night the webinar begins at 6 o'clock. You know, everybody's wanting to see the map, you know, and I was blessed to see it interviewing you, and you showed it. We spent probably 35 minutes.
I thought you were supposed to show them at the last conference.
Just analyzing this thing and you explaining it to us. What should people prepare themselves for tomorrow night's webinar, and how important is it that they get this information and understand it?
Well, one thing, Pastor, I hope that they, you know, once they see that map, they take a mental note of it and track the activity, right? Because chances are it's going to match up with those spots when there's time goes forward. And since that, because I don't expect everybody to instantly accept everything from everybody, right?
Right.
I've got some great speakers on there. They do a good job. I have a small, tiny.
And then I'll come pick that up. Yeah.
Wi-Fi might have dropped out. Let me have a look. Yeah, Wi-Fi dropped out, guys. Okay, reconnected.
Keep yelling, right? But
Yep.
things are happening. That's not coincidence.
No.
Right? That's
Yeah,
just
and
not
you know, that
coincidence.
point you just said, yourself and Gil Brazard, Marshall Masters, Stephen Benenoon, Bart with his documentary, with the passion. I think you just nailed it. Every presentation, the passion. These guys are yelling. They're saying, listen, it's coming. These things are going to be taking place. You need to prepare yourselves. You need to understand. And they all understand the Bible. So they know that the things and the signs and the info that they've been able to acquire matches the scriptures. And so then, you know, and of course, your expertise, which is incredible, just goes right along with the same thing. All of you guys together, collectively, if somebody takes a step back and says, what did I get from all of this collectively? Collectively, it's watchmen are screaming on the top of the wall that time is coming to an end as we know it. It's not, this world that we've been living in is not going to sustain itself. And there is a greater answer. There is a remedy to all this. And his name is Jesus Christ.
That's right.
The watchmen are screaming. You're right.
That's right, Pastor Paul, because everything the Lord did when he came into this earth, he gave us a moment of freedom to really reflect, to grow, to think, to consider. And I think that time is coming abruptly to a close. And when he comes back, it's going to be too late. And you know, that sensation of all these things leading up to his return, I can't help but to see it, because it's not that people don't know these days, it's that they're turning away from. And see, there's a difference between not knowing and then a person does know, but they turn away.
Yeah.
In today's world, people say, well, I don't want to hear that part. Just let me go have my fun. They're turning away.
Yes.
And I've never experienced that such volume before like it is today. It's a lot of people doing that. They're turning away. They know and they turn away. And so that makes it different than any other time. And historically, that always happens right before the great calamities come. Always. It never fails. It always happens that way.
Mike, I appreciate you coming on tonight, and just, you know what, it was a fascinating evening. I just really just sat here and absorbed a lot of great info tonight and wisdom, and I think our audience did too. So I really appreciate you sharing this stuff, and I look forward to watching the webinar myself tomorrow evening, even though I was involved in it all. I look forward to listening, watching it all, and taking it all in one evening, because at the end of the day, I'm going to have a more clear picture and more understanding of the fulfillment of God's word and how necessarily important and you dropped some bombs in this. I mean, you really did, especially when you just said what you believe, what you see happening in 2023 based on the information you have. People better it's going to be a wake-up call for mankind. Would you agree?
It will be. It's going to be it's going to look scary through one eye. Right? But the Lord has already told us. Remember, anything that happens to the world, it's going to be for their destruction because they made a decision. Anything that happens in the world for us is for our deliverance. Because our Savior, the one that opens the seals that allows anything to happen. So it's for us against those who are against him. Right? That's why no believer should be frightened. And anybody who's on a fence, realize there is no fence. A person who sits on the fence has already said no, not today. That's what they've actually said, not today. I'm not doing it today. So I hope that no one sits on the fence and they go ahead and recognize that initial call they had when they were young. Nobody had to teach them that Jesus was real, that Jesus was Jesus and God was God. Nobody had to teach them that. No. So that's confirmation that they have been marked, they've been touched, they've been called, right? They're marked for eternal life, not for condemnation or damnation, marked for eternal life, or they would not believe, because the Bible teaches me that all those, Jesus said, those who have come to me, the Father hath given me, and I will in no wise lose. So if we actually believe in Christ, it's because God put the belief in us that we may be kept and fully delivered. And that's the process we undergo here. And we shouldn't get that mixed up.
No, we shouldn't.
Hopefully we don't. But hopefully people know that, Pastor Paul, because we truly do have a good Father. And what's coming to the earth is just not going to be comforting at all.
No. Mike from around the world. Mike, I appreciate you coming on tonight. Really do. Thank you for being with us tonight.
God bless, Pastor Paul. It's always an honor.
The honor's mine, brother. It really is. God bless.
All
right. I think he told us it's not going to be comfortable.
It's time to get rolling.
With activity both good and evil that defied the laws. The Bible is packed with activity both good and evil that defied the laws of nature. Why don't we see this kind of supernaturalism occurring in our lifetime? What happened to miracles, sorcery, or magic? Today's guests believe that they may have the answer to these questions, and you won't see it coming. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Skywatch TV. I'm Joe Artis Horn. Are you in for a treasure trove of surprises today? We begin our fourth installation on the brand new series from Defender Publishing, The Mystery of Jesus from Genesis to Revelation. And before we continue this explosive discussion, I'm going to introduce who's in house. First, he's a multi-time critically acclaimed best-selling author and CEO of Skywatch Television, Dr. Thomas Horn. Good to be here. Thank you. She's a credentialed private investigator with a degree in psychology that oversees the research arm of Skywatch TV and Defender Publishing, Allie Anderson. He's a documentarian filmmaker, best-selling author, and nationally recognized radio personality, Mr. Josh Peck. Hey, Joe, good to be here. And she's a credentialed ordained reverend with a degree in Bible and theology, a powerful voice in Christian television, Donna Howell.
Thank you. Good to be here.
How many of you have gone bananas with the reveal after reveal after reveal that we've been experiencing over the last few weeks on this incredible new 3-book anthology from Defender Publishing that people are describing as Tom Horn's magnum opus, and what I consider to be probably the most important work Defender Publishing has ever put out? It is the life of Jesus Christ illuminated in a way that has never been compiled ever before. And it's done in a way that everybody from laity that are just becoming familiar with the Bible itself, maybe new Christians, as well as Bible theologians and scholars that have been reading about the Bible and doing heavy lifting research for decades. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, Tom, you even said that in this series, as you guys were compiling the research, you even had epiphany moments for the very first time after decades in ministry.
They absolutely were. Some of the stuff that Donna and Allie were doing research on for this book, I mean, I was like mind blown, seriously, and powerful. Like, like how could this have been hidden for so long? And Joe, I would add one other thing. Nobody's library. If you're watching this program, you need to know that your library is not complete if you do not have this 3-volume set. You've not heard me say that before. I'm saying it about this 3-volume series. Every pastor should have this in their library. Every serious student of either history or the Bible. It will literally transform your life. It will. It'll transform your life and theology, your respect for this unusual man who came to earth, set aside his godness, for want of a different term, to lay down his life as a sacrifice for humanity. Starting back with Rome, everybody else are trying to stamp out Christianity, and the harder they tried, the more it grew like a wildfire, until 200 years later, nobody on earth was saying, great is the goddess Diana. It brought about the literal downfall of all of these pagan entities. And this is part of what we're going to be talking about today. What happened? You know, the Bible only tells the truth. So you're in the Exodus and miracles are happening. The magicians of Egypt can mimic almost everything that was happening as Moses spoke the words of God to Pharaoh to let his people go. We don't see that in our world today. What in the world was it that happened that brought about a crushing of these supernatural evil entities?
And Donna, I teased that at the front of the program, but what Tom is saying is true. You know, we see all kinds of evil sorcery and great supernatural miracles in the Bible. But it appears that much of that has ceased to exist today. I mean, you guys wrote the sudden disappearance of sorcery may actually have something to do with the Magi who followed the star of Bethlehem. How on earth is that connected?
Right. I want to say that we got there first, but actually it came from the church father Ignatius. He made this connection, and when he did, the scholars went bananas and they started coming up with all different kinds of connections. Why don't we hear about that today? I don't have an answer for that, but we should be. This is why, if you're a preacher, you need to buy these books. And I'm not trying to sell anything, but there's at least 66 sermons and probably at least twice that going on in this book. For real. So to discuss the Magi, first of all, let's break down the Christmas Carol version of events. There was not 3 of anything. There was frankincense, gold, myrrh. Historians and scholars believe that that's why we come to the idea that there was 3 Magi, but there wasn't 3 of anything, biblically speaking. Historically speaking, the traveling conditions of the ancient world, especially with 3 guys on camels or whatever carrying these really, really expensive gifts. If they tried to go from afar in the east to Bethlehem, they would have been marauded on the streets by mercenaries. So the idea was that there were probably at least 12 to 18 of them. So we 3 nothing. There was probably 12 to 18 of these men. Now, Magi, sometimes synonymous to wise men, but only as it reflects in Zoroastrianism and astrology reading and different things like that. The word magi comes from the Greek megos. Prior to that, it comes from the Hebrew rab mog. Okay, and what this word is it links to the sorcerers in the royal king's court as far back as Babylon and further into Persia. So when we say the word magi, we're not talking about kings, we're talking about the king's men. And we're talking about the highest level of king's men. Now, these men, what they were known for, their actual job description, they were prophets. They read the stars, they were magi astrologers, and they were literally the guys who would say, hey, king, there's a guy coming, and it might be another king from another kingdom, it might be a ruler, or it might be, in the case of Alexander the Great, there is a great destroyer coming, or there is a great conqueror coming, and guess what? His birth was predicted accurately, down to the day, by the Magi. So when the Magi, in the time of Christ, decided to start responding to this prophecy of this king of the Jews, that is why Herod, by the way, allowed him into his presence. The reason why Herod took the Magi seriously when they came into his presence and said, hey, there's this new baby, it's a new king, it's a king of the Jews. The reason why he said, go find him, tell me where he's at so I can worship him too, which of course we all know was a trick. He thereafter decided that all the babies under a certain age had to die, or the male babies at least, to cut off the line of this king. He took them seriously. Why? Because their predictions were known to be accurate. The Magi had a very powerful sway and authority in the ancient world. Fast forward. They come to Herod. He says, find him, come back and tell me where he's at. They do go and find him, and they fall down and worship him. Listen to me. There was no palace. There was no opulence. There was no gold and shining armor. There were no soldiers. They literally walked into this itty bitty little house with what scholars assume was approximately a Christ child the age of 2, a munchkin Messiah. I mean, today the equivalent would be a kid on diapers watching Yo Gabba Gabba. This is the Messiah. They fell and worshiped him. That's how much faith the Magi had.
Wow.
They were deeply entrenched in sorcery, divination, Zoroastrianism, which I know Tom's just busting at the seams to talk further about. But the bottom line is they had no reason to have faith in this thing except something, insert Yahweh here, told them this is a real deal. Take this seriously. Then instead of going back to Herod, they obeyed Yahweh, who spoke to them in a dream and said, go about some other direction. Don't go back to Herod. Now, here comes Church Father Ignatius, right? When these Gentiles obeyed what Yahweh told them to do and they worshiped the Messiah, Church Father Ignatius says, how then was Christ manifested to the world? A star shone in heaven beyond all the stars. By this, the star and the Magi's obedience regarding it, all magic was dissolved. All sorcery was broken. They were the representatives of the sorcerers in that day.
Wow.
So I'm not trying to strip away the prettiness of the Christmas carol. I'm trying to introduce a prettier concept. They went, and because of their obedience, the magic and the sorcery in the unseen realm was broken.
Wow.
Wow. Donna, the only other thing that I would add to this is there is evidence that the modern Magi, the Zoroastrians of that day, were very familiar with the prophecies of Daniel. So Daniel was this legendary Hebrew prophet. Everybody through the Middle East knew him. They knew his prophecies. And definitely, I believe this was also true of the Magi Zoroastrians. Why do I say that? Because this story about Daniel had permeated the Middle East, that he was trying to get a revelation from God concerning the future of the Hebrews and the future of the world. And he's praying for 21 days and he's not getting an answer. But then the angel comes to him and says this, Daniel 10, 12 through 14. Then he said to me, don't be afraid, Daniel, for from the first day that you did set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard. I have come because of your words. However, the prince of the kingdom of Persia, this is important, resisted me for 21 days. By the way, Persia in that day was Iran and part of Iraq. So the prince of the kingdom of Persia resisted me for 21 days, but behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me because I had been detained there with the king of Persia. Now I have come to explain to you what will happen to your people in future days, for the vision concerns days yet to come. This was a prediction that the Zoroastrians of that day and later on in the New Testament were fully familiar with Daniel giving this prophecy, this vision of the end of time that would include the coming of a child, a Messiah, but also the coming of Antichrist. And he foresaw from the time of Christ through the weeks that we usually break up into the Great Tribulation period. So when they heard the announcement about this, they connected it to the prophecy of Daniel. Why? Because Persia was the seat of Zoroastrianism. This was essentially their history. Now, they didn't couch it the way we do, but they believed that there was a cosmic conflict between the god of light, Ahura Mazda, and the evil demon or god of darkness, Ahriman. That's why the series we're running at Skywatch right now is called the Ahriman Gate. This was their faith system. This is what they believed. And they saw that Daniel had keyed directly into this and tied it to the end time. So when they heard that a Messiah, the King of the Jews, I think they put two and two together, and they went there. There's no story that they gave their lives to Jesus, but they did bow down and worship him. It's reasonable to believe that because from that point forward, the prince of Persia was broken. The god of darkness and his power and reach was confined by just the simple birth of this child, and the world had not even yet saw what he was going to do to illustrate his authority over the powers of darkness.
That's right. And then you run across the character called Simon the magician in Acts 8:9. It says, there was a certain man called Simon, which before time in the same city used sorcery. What happened to his sorcery?
Right.
I mean, why do we run across this character in the book of Acts? Before time, the past, something was broken. And then later on, he sees the apostles are running around laying hands on people. They're speaking in tongues. Miracles are happening. And Simon wants to buy it because he thinks it's the sorcery has been discovered again. Like there's proof all over the place, but it's just not made the right connection.
Right. I want to switch gears, Josh, and get you in on this because as Tom has alluded, you do know a lot about the Essenes. And of course, how many of you, show of hands, have read Josh's book, The Lost Prophecies of Qumran, 2025 and the Final Age of Man? That book went so gangbusters and so viral, it was insane, but for good reason. Josh, I consider you, if I want to know what is CERN up to or what were the Essenes about or Qumran, I know who I'm talking to. I consider you to be the most highly qualified expert over all of those varying topics.
Thank you.
And so here's Donna. She's talking about the Magi, but it's not just them, is it?
No, but it does all connect because this has to do with the presence of the Holy Spirit on earth, that breaking of sorcery. But this also has to do with some prophetic things that the Essenes wrote about. So for those not familiar, the Essenes were the writers and keepers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Their theology was very close to Christianity, and this would have been a couple hundred years before Christ. But they had a calendar system that's much different than what we use. They actually saw all of human history as being broken up into a 7,000-year period, broken up into what they called ages. So there were 3 ages that were 2,000 years apiece, and then one final Sabbath age, which we would recognize as the millennial reign of Christ. And then after that, the new creation. So they also split these ages into other time groups. There's a lot of them, but we can just mainly focus on Jubilees, which is a 50-year period. And what they noticed is that at the end of each age, before the next one was going to come in, there was this final Jubilee period of 50 years, which was almost like a transitionary period. But during that time, you would have a lot of miracles, but also a lot of demonic stuff going. So a great example of that is the end of the age of Torah. That would have been between 25 AD and 75 AD. Well, you got all of Jesus' ministry, all those miracles, and then you got all the demonic stuff too that happened at that time. Now, in the church age, and they actually called our age the age of grace. They didn't fully understand what the church was going to be. Ephesians 3 tells us that it was a mystery to be revealed later. But in the church age, we know that the power of the Holy Spirit is restraining the power of darkness. And there's actually some interesting church history on that. But first, Acts 16 through 19 says, now, as we were going to the place of prayer, a slave girl met us who had a spirit that enabled her to foretell the future by supernatural means. She brought her owners a great profit by fortune telling. She followed behind Paul and us and kept crying out, these men are servants of the Most High God who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation. Just real quick, isn't it interesting that she didn't lie there? She's actually telling the truth.
Right.
That'll be important in a minute. The verse continues. She continued to do this for many days, but Paul became greatly annoyed and turned and said to the spirit, I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And it came out at once, but when her owners saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them to the marketplace before the authorities. We actually have further accounts of this kind of thing happening in early church history, of actual magic and sorcery diminishing. So this is from Eusebius. Quote, about that time it is said that Apollo spoke from a deep and gloomy cavern. This would have been really early church. And through the medium of no human voice, and declared that the righteous men on earth, Christians, were a bar to his speaking the truth. He suffered his tresses to droop in token of grief, and mourned the evils which the loss of the oracular spirit would entail on mankind. So here Apollo is actually admitting that Christians were making it difficult for him to speak. But this kept happening. And it's really funny because it sounds like he couldn't help himself. because this kept happening and the old gods weren't speaking through the oracles anymore, weren't able to, there was a huge, massive Christian persecution. So even more, the restraining power of the Holy Spirit was actually causing these false gods to have to be honest when they were talking to Christians. So there's other examples of Lactantius actually records Apollo's final messages before he just went dead silent. So first, he explains who he is. This is the words of Apollo here. He says, self-produced, untaught, without a mother, unshaken, a name not even to be comprised in word, dwelling in fire. This is God, and we, his messengers, are a slight portion of God. So here Apollo is actually making mention that there's a true God and it's not him.
Oh, wow.
And that he's a messenger or an angel, you know, of his. This would be a fallen angel, of course, but he's actually admitting this. When he was asked how he wanted to be addressed, you know, how do you want to be addressed, Apollo? Apollo said, quote, "Oh, all wise, all learned, versed in many pursuits, hear, O demon." Like he can't help but to let the truth out. You know, he probably didn't want to say that, but but apparently he kept doing this over and over again. Lactantius continues. So this is Lactantius speaking. He said, quote, "And so again, when at the entreaty of someone he uttered an imprecation against the Sminthian Apollo, he began with this verse. O harmony of the world, bearing light, all-wise demon. What therefore remains except that by his own confession he is subject to the scourge of the true God and to everlasting punishment? For in another response he also said, the demons who go about the earth and about the sea without weariness are subdued beneath the scourge of God." So the presence of the Holy Spirit in Christians not only was just breaking down the powers of darkness, but it was actually causing them to have to be honest. And of course, that spread led to a huge persecution. But we see a resurgence of sorcery. We don't see sorcery and stuff like that in our church age, but we do see a resurgence of sorcery and witchcraft during the tribulation period. So one example, Revelation 9:20-21. Says, the rest of mankind who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands so as not to worship demons and idols, gold, silver, brass, stone, and wood, which can neither see nor hear nor walk. They did not repent of their murders nor of their witchcraft. So something changed. Witchcraft exists again in the tribulation. Well, we actually know exactly what changed, and this is exciting, and this is a big source of hope for all of us. 2 Thessalonians 2:6-8 says, "And now you know what is restraining, that he may be revealed in his own time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, but he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming." So the Holy Spirit is the restrainer, and when he's taken up, we get to go with him. That's obviously the rapture. And then on earth, the kingdom of darkness isn't going to be restrained anymore. So that restraining force of the Holy Spirit in believers will be gone during that time. Now, according to the Essenes, here's where it gets really exciting. The year 2025 marks the beginning of the final Jubilee, a transition period between the church age and the age to come, the millennial reign, where they expect to see miracles and sorceries and that kind of stuff as well. I believe, personally, the first of those will be the rapture. After that, everything's unrestrained again, and we're back to a time of sorcery and all that darkness, but we won't have to be here during that. So that's really exciting.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about the 3-book anthology, The Mystery of Jesus from Genesis to Revelation, and we want to make sure that you know how you can get a copy of these 3 books along with the largest giveaway of the year. We'll be right back.
Ladies and gentlemen, Donna Howell, Dr. Thomas Horn, and Allie Anderson team up to bring you their
Welcome back to Skywatch TV. I'm Joe Artis Horn. I want to continue right before we run out of time with you, Donna. We're talking about the 3-book anthology, The Mystery of Jesus from Genesis to Revelation. During this week's program, we've been talking about where did the sorcery, the magic, the mysticism that we were seeing in the Old Testament taking place so often, where did it go? Josh had some really neat insights, and I laughed a couple of times. It almost sounded like mandatory truth serum from the Lord.
Yeah.
You can't really fight it.
Yep.
You have to tell the truth.
Exactly.
But Donna, we've covered why sorcery has ceased. But in the New Testament, of course, miracles were happening left and right, all over the place.
Yeah.
Why don't we see that kind of activity today?
Right. Well, it's first of all important to remember that we do see a lot of that activity outside the West. We have a little bit of a faith crisis going on in the West right now. I think that there's probably, and I am not talking to you particularly at home, so don't be angry, but I think that there's a lot of people that have a very selfish motive when they ask for a certain kind of miracle. And I think that when you look back at the original languages in the New Testament, what is being described there is not necessarily something that benefits the asker. So what we're looking at, miracle in the New Testament, is the Greek word semeion, or sign. A literal word for word translation of the word miracle in New Testament is sign. So what is it a sign of? The Lexham Theological Word Book, they state this word is the object or occurrence that makes it possible for one to recognize something important that is otherwise ambiguous or unknown to the spectator. So they give this as an example. This basic sense is attested in the New Testament in the instance, listen to this, has nothing to do with any supernatural activity, in the instant where Judas's kiss serves as a sign revealing Jesus' identity to the men tasked with seizing him. So without Judas's sign of the kiss, the Roman soldiers wouldn't have recognized. That has nothing to do with the miracle. The word sign. So when you read that there's a miracle happening, you need to remember in the New Testament that Jesus was brand new on the scene. He was the Messiah who was coming to fulfill. Of course, it's going to happen all over the place because these miracles are serving as a semeion, right? A sign. So there were signs of Jesus's supernatural authority over nature and also signs of the power that was given him by the Father. So we have to, when we pray for a miracle today, we have to really soul search. Look at every single miracle given in the New Testament. These people shot up, ran around, preached the gospel, and said, "You'll never believe I met this guy. They're calling him the Messiah. They're calling him the King of the Jews. Look at what he did for me." If you're not willing to do that, and God knows your heart, if you're not willing to do that, don't expect an answer to your miracle that you're asking for. It's in the Greek. It's for the benefit that Jesus would be shown as a sign that he had the authority from the Father.
Right. But join us next week as we discuss what Paul really meant when he wrote to the Colossians that Jesus removed the writ and what eternity really looks like. For everybody here in studio, everybody on the panel, I'm Joe Horn. Keep your eyes on the prize, which is Jesus Christ. We'll be back.
Okay, guys, I'm out too. Thanks for joining. See you tomorrow, guys. God bless. Hope my voice is back.